evening. I'd like to call this meeting of the Municipal Council to order at 6:31. We're going to do a salute to the flag, and as soon as we're done, I'm going to ask everyone to remain standing as we do a moment of silence for our colleague Sarah Lynn Reynolds' mother, who passed away. She won't be here today, as the services are tonight. So please rise and join me for a salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Our thoughts are with Sarah Lynn and her family this evening. I would entertain a motion to suspend the rules.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? We're now operating under suspended rules just in the event, because we have several public hearings, anything can happen, so I'd rather be prepared. I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of April 8th, 15th, May 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th.
Second.
Thank you. Motion is in order. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Oh, yeah?
Yeah, their meeting was posted for. They didn't know.
How about that?
Yes.
All right, no worries. All right, so, Madam Assistant Clerk?
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind reading the notice of do we have anyone from National Grid here? No? So we'll go into the reading of the first, actually the third public hearing, please.
Sure. Public hearing. Relative to the proposal of fiscal year 2026 general budget.
Thank you. Do we have anyone to speak in favor?
Good evening.
Good evening, Mason. Haven't seen you in a while.
It's been a little while. Mason Lord, City's Director of Budget and Administration, 181 County Street. And I do have a presentation prepared as well as some copies of the presentation. All right, so as I said, Mason Lord, City's Director of Budget and Administration, appearing in support of the proposed general government budget, which is the first public hearing. So I prepared a presentation just to go through some of the big budget highlights. I apologize in advance for my voice. I've been in the field the last few days. You can probably tell from the sunburn. So just apologize in advance. But
No worries. Actually, Mason, before you begin, I just want to ensure you know Council Kovas won't be here tonight. He has work obligations, which entails colleagues coming from out of actually the country, and a work obligation he can't get out of, and he tried. But he's been here for every single one of the budget hearings that we've had, as well. I know you, him, the city auditor have had ample conversations. So just wanted you to not take that personally.
Absolutely. Thank you, President.
Thank you, sir.
So just an overview of the budget as a whole. The city's operating budget traditionally has 5 revenue sources. You'll notice that number 5 is strike through this year. Those 5 revenue sources are local property taxes, state aid, local receipts, enterprise fund, indirect costs, and existing resources. Local property taxes. This is the biggest portion of our revenues. Remains a relatively consistent percentage of our budget year to year. We are relatively conservative when budgeting our new growth. The new growth estimate, the 2026 new growth estimate, that is provided directly from the city assessor, Julie Hobson. So we use that as part of our preparation phase with the budget. And usually what happens is we shore those numbers up in the fall and sort of get a modified budget right before the tax rate. So this is pretty typical. This is right around the usual number we're at year to year. Gives us a little bit of wiggle room if something does change, but this again we try to take a conservative approach across the city. So you'll notice that the estimate in FY25 was around this number at $985,000 and ultimately came in just under $1.5 million. So hopefully we have a similar result this year. As you all know, there were some staffing challenges or some positional cuts, not staffing cuts, but positional cuts in the original budget, proposed budget, that we would love to be able to add back immediately in the fall. Those are sort of some of the first priorities. So if we do have a good new growth coming in the fall, that's going to be some of those first steps. Significant portion of the local property taxes is the debt exclusion. This is pretty much leveled out at this point, just under $7 million. This is net of the premium paid on bans. So we reissued our ban in November. So this is the proceeds from that ban.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind just talking a little bit about what a ban is for those watching at home?
Perfect.
Thanks.
So there's two types of borrowings. We have temporary and long-term borrowings. A bond would be your long-term borrowing, what individuals would be more familiar with at home. A ban is our short-term borrowing. So usually during a project, when we don't have to actually go out for that 15, 20, 30 years on the project, we'll be short-term financing. And what that entails is really just having to pay the interest, sort of the juice on the principal year to year. Eventually, after a certain number of years, you do have to make a principal pay down. This will actually be the first year on the high school ban that we'll have to make a principal pay down, so that is one of the changes in the budget. But again, even with that principal pay down, we're still sort of under that $7 million mark that we were at last year. So this excluded debt, for the high school project is really leveled off at this point. At this point, we are anticipating not really having to go long on that last portion of the ban that was renewed. It ultimately depends on the MSBA and what their final renewal is after closeout. That process could be about 2 to 3 years. We're hoping to get that going in the next few months, probably around September, October, subject to closing out the solar array at the high school. But there's sort of a 5% holdback on the overall project reimbursement that doesn't get finalized until we've gone through full closeout. And that can be a pretty long process. There also, as many of the folks probably know, there's a lot of MSBA projects going around throughout the state. It's obviously a great program providing new schools to communities across the state. So they're relatively backed up at this point. So state aid. State aid is actually one of the local revenues this year that increased. So the biggest change is that we had a significant reduction in our assessments. So we've talked about how one of our free cash numbers, or one of the fall throughs from free cash last year, was that difference between the charter school assessment and the actual charter school assessments. So the state, as part of the cherry sheet assessments, they tell us an estimate of what they're anticipating billing us out of our state aid for charter schools. Ultimately, we're not really able to make an adjustment mid-year, so when those numbers come down significantly from their assessment, there's not really anything we can do. It looks like at this point in the FY26 budget, that gap has been relatively closed. So I think we've sort of solved that, but that remains to be seen. Again, if those changes happen throughout the year, we can't really make an adjustment for that in the budget. But the result for us is a pretty significant increase in state aid. Additionally, large increase in Chapter 78, which is the biggest portion of our state aid. That was driven by a number of factors. Primarily, we had a 2% enrollment increase from 6,313 students to 6,440 students, and that's district-wide census data. I believe it's from the prior October to the school year. And then another driving factor was we had a reduction in our municipal revenue growth factor. If you'll remember, we talked about that in the fall around the certification of free cash. We had a reduction from 4.33% to 3.9%. And in the school's Chapter 70 funding formula, the way they calculate our share is they essentially take last year's contribution from the city, multiply it by 1 plus that growth factor, and then they'll add a percentage. So that's sort of how they back into the city's contribution, and then they make up the delta between what they determine it costs to educate a student and the actual cost in state aid. So if we have a reduction in that municipal revenue growth factor, it ultimately yields us a larger amount of Chapter 70 aid. Obviously, we've talked about it before. The formula is a little bit broken, but that's one of those ways that we can use the formula in our favor and be pretty tactical about how we budget our local receipts. So speaking of local receipts, about 9.4% of our revenue. This is relatively consistent, actually the same percentage as last year. So you'll notice this year we highlighted, and I apologize, you'll notice the printing on your sheet looks a lot better than on the board. I'm not sure why the formatting got changed in the PowerPoint, but the local receipts that factor into the municipal revenue growth factor, those are highlighted in blue. So you'll notice in our FY24 actuals, in a lot of cases, and actually in all cases, our FY26 budgeted are lower than the FY24 actuals. The only exception being solid waste, where we have a direct, proposed rate that we can tie that budgeted amount to. But across the board, everywhere else, we are extremely conservative in those categories, and that's very intentional. And that's ultimately when those revenues come in higher, we have a larger free cash certification the next year and have more capacity to do capital within the city. But if we are over-aggressive in how we budget those revenues and they come in shorter, we obviously have to close the gap on those in other places, and that's a sort of a hit against our free cash. Indirect costs.
Mason, may I ask a question about local receipts and where are we in terms of, are we on track for where we should be at this time of the year? Are there anywhere that we're concerned about?
Actually, at this point, definitely on track. And in some of the categories that we were a little bit unsure of last year, because we started to see some downward trends in things like the marijuana local option tax.
Yep.
I think we had started to see a downtrend in that, and part of what the thing is there is, with all the businesses coming on in Rhode Island, that might be, we might be starting to see the effect of, people aren't coming over the border to buy at our retail shops, and maybe they're buying over in Rhode Island. That's actually leveled off. So we feel pretty confident at this, about this number, which again is relatively close to the 24 actuals, but I think we're feeling pretty good about those numbers. And we're seeing those receipts come in relatively consistent. Similar with meals. I think meals I was a little bit concerned going into halfway through 25 that we were kind of leveled off and potentially going down, and we've actually remained pretty consistent with those 24 levels. So feel pretty confident about that $1,025,000 number.
Great.
Motor vehicle excise, we just saw our major commitments a couple months ago for FY25, and they are on track to FY24 plus. So I think we're still in a place where we expect to do slightly, or at least around FY24, but probably better in most of those categories, which sets us up well for in the future years.
Sure. Thank you for that.
Indirect costs. So indirect costs are essentially the assessed administrative costs for administering the enterprise funds in the city of Attleboro. So obviously we have employees and different services across the city that directly support the enterprises. So to capture those costs back through the budget to make sure that we can provide the administrative support, we assess an indirect cost. We are in year 5 of our current indirect cost study. So this is definitely going to be the last year. I would say the usable life on an indirect cost study is 3 to 5 years. We're at the tail end of that. We'd really hoped to do it this year. Unfortunately, just with some personnel turnover, as well as myself being out for an extended period of time and being sort of a key factor in the indirect cost model, we just weren't able to do that this year. So we're going to look to do that this fall and hope to implement, and will implement for FY27. So that's something of note, because as you can see back in FY20 and 21, the shift was relatively significant from the indirect cost percentages on the previous study to this study that we're currently on. 4% is a relatively large factor, right? So if they come in and we recognize that the administrative support of the city is actually lower to water or wastewater, the percentage would reflect that. If it's higher, it could also reflect that. So that's a pretty long process. We'll be looking to go out to bid for that this fall, and that'll be reflected in both the water and wastewater budgets, because they basically split the cost of that study. Any questions on this?
I have one, Mason.
Councilor LeVoy?
Thank you. Can you just talk, I know we talked about it before last year, but can you just mention for everyone at home too, if they're looking at the chart, just the drop in investment income I know obviously 23, 24, or sorry, yeah, 23, 24 are pretty high, and then I know we dropped last year, we talked about it, but seeing that we came up a little bit this year, but still very far down from 23, 24.
Yeah, great point. So investment income, that is one of those municipal revenue growth factor revenues. It is driven by the amount of liquidity that the city has on hand and sort of where the city treasurer is putting that cash on hand and the rates that we're getting, the rates of return. Obviously, we're in a much higher interest rate environment now. We are anticipating some rate cuts over the next year, but we are in a much higher interest rate environment, and that's been relatively sustained over the last 3 years. But if you look at the historicals of the city, back to, I'd say between 2005 to 2016, we were really hovering in that less than $100,000 range to maybe $120,000 on the high end. So in terms of just being sustainable, I think the concern is if the interest rates change over the next even 1 to 3 years, that if we really adjusted for what we're bringing in now, we would just never be able to get back to that place. And the other piece too is a lot of the money that came through federal programs has gone out the door. So one of the items that was included in the budget this year was the ARPA update. And you'll notice, I believe from March 31st, about 80% of that money had gone out the door at this point. And that's $7 million, right? So in terms of money that's available to us on hand, that's less money to be earning investment income on. Additionally, the high school project is winding down. The amount of cash on hand for the high school project is obviously going out the door, and we're looking to close out that project soon. The high school project, when you have a $260 million project and you have a significant amount of reimbursement coming in from the state as well as cash coming in from the authorizations, we had a lot of money on hand for that project. So there was a lot of investment income directly derived from that project. So that's sort of, at this point, we're in between large projects. On the city side, water and wastewater could obviously be a little bit different, but those interests, those investment incomes wouldn't come to the general fund. So at this point, we want to be really conservative with that figure. And the best thing about that is if those revenues come in higher, falls through to free cash, it's one of the perfect revenues to go for funding capital or funding debt. So as I mentioned on the first slide, there was an X through existing resources. FY26, the proposed budget is not supported by any use of the city stabilization fund or any use of free cash. So it's truly a balanced budget, and we're not using any one-time revenue sources to balance that budget. We're very proud of that. We think that's really important given the discussion around ratings agencies' methodologies changes and potential ratings cut that could be in front of us. This is one of those efforts to really show that we're operating in a balanced and sustainable state. And additionally, another big component of this was we had, on the general government budget, we had a significant debt fall off. In the last few years, the approach of the city has been to fund a reserve for capital, balancing it with a one-time revenue of free cash. The approach this year to sort of maintain that revenue capacity for debt was to not balance that reserve with free cash and instead bring it on to an operating revenue. So we've shifted that reserve for capital over to the operating budget and a true recurring revenue. That's not to say that in future years, if we bring on additional debt, we wouldn't go back to using free cash to provide funds for the capital reserve. But in this year, to ensure that we're not losing that capacity to fund debt to operating costs, we really wanted to make sure that we weren't balancing. So that's really the approach there. Speaking of free cash, again, I think on your printout you can see every line, but the PowerPoint's a little bit messed up here. But this was our free cash certified in 2025. So this is our fiscal year 24 free cash certified for use in fiscal year 25. This was certified in October. At that time it came down. We spoke about some of the potential uses, the things on the horizon. You'll notice at the bottom there's 6 pending items. One of them is already before you, and 5 are actually will be read into the record tonight. So those are some significant communication items. A few of those consistent with what we actually discussed at the budget meetings last week. So I know those are going to be before you, so I won't go into the details, but if there's going to be any questions on those, please reach out. The number that you see at the bottom would be if today there was no additional requests for appropriation from free cash, that would be what would fall through to next year. Last year, when we closed out the fiscal year, we had about 2.7 million remaining. This would be obviously a little bit more significant. We did have a higher free cash percentage this year than prior year. And additionally, there was a significant push to obligate all those ARPA funds before December 31st. So we did a lot of really good things with those available ARPA funds, and that the reflection of not using free cash for some of the traditional capital projects we would do, we really recognize the benefit here. And now we have a little bit more capacity, sort of a trickle-down effect over the next couple of years that we'll be able to fund capital with. So that's really where that benefit comes from. Is there any questions on what free cash has been utilized for this year? So again, circle back to ARPA. I think it's important in the context of the budget. We've included it as an appendix to give an update of where everything's at, because it actually directly impacts the FY26 budget, just because so much of the work that's been done over the last few years has been using one-time funding sources through ARPA. We have not funded operational expenses through ARPA, with the exception of some of the efforts at the water department over the last 6 months, and also the zoo. But for the most part, we didn't fund actual direct operating expenses. So in total, we received about $9.55 million in ARPA funds through the state and local fiscal recovery funds. This is what we've called city ARPA, because we also have the Bristol County ARPA program, so it's just a little bit easier to kind of split the two that way. We ultimately obligated 100% of these funds by December 31st, 2025, which was a pretty significant lift, which we appreciate the council's support in sort of creating a flexible environment there to ensure that we had the ability at the 11th hour to shift contingency from some projects to other projects where we could get more things accomplished. And we were really able to do a lot of great work across the city. Some highlights include water and wastewater, of course. Receiving about 62% of the city ARPA funds, which was about $3.35 million for the water enterprise projects and $2.59 million for wastewater. So when we talk about the rates, it's important to recognize how much the city's really put into supporting rate mitigation efforts. So mitigating rate increases by funding capital through ARPA has been a really big effort over the last few years between both city and Bristol ARPA. The schools, 8.4%.
Real quick question before we move on. The previous slide, the last sentence, I think is pretty important to point out about having to ensure that everything was obligated by December of last year, and what happens if it's not expended by December 31st, 2026.
Yeah, so any funds that weren't obligated by December 31st, 2024 would have been due back to the federal government through the Treasury. We had to do reporting on that on March 31st. When everything was filled out, it confirmed that we had no anticipated return of funds. Everything had been obligated, so we'll be waiting to hear back in terms of audit and things like that. And then we have until December 31st of 2026 to actually expend the funds. So the term obligated would mean contracted, or essentially a purchase order for like supplies or equipment, or a contract for services by that date. And then you would have essentially the 2 calendar years to actually spend down those funds. So the obligated versus expended is really the key word there. On December 31st, 2026, the money actually has to be out the door. The way we set up the projects and really funding capital and trying to fund a lot of equipment purchases and things like that, we really expect that money to move out relatively quickly. Like I said, on March 31st, I think we were about 80%, you see right on the board. And a lot of that really moved in the last 6 months. So we've made a lot of progress there, and I think I don't feel any concern that this money won't go out the door. Again, it's all been obligated. We could be looking at, in the range of hundreds or like $1,000, somewhere if there's something small where the cost to put the decals on a vehicle came back cheaper, right? And it was obligated, and then they gave us a discount or something happened. Could be talking about really small amounts of money, but everything is obligated at this point.
All in all, pretty good news story.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So just some additional highlights, some funding for the schools, $805,000 or 8.4% of our ARPA funds. Just under 8% for culture and recreation efforts, including the zoo and the library. You'll remember, the cash infusion into the zoo, as well as funding of the library flooring replacement project that is ongoing. 6.8% or $652,000 for public works. That included some flood mitigation efforts, as well as some pavement restoration and sidewalks. So a lot of good work there. And then additionally, 6% or just over $570,000 for public safety efforts. One of the exciting ones is the new training equipment they have over there for, I believe it's for active shooter. So a lot of really good training over there for actually police de-escalation of force. And I know the chief's really excited about that. So we've done a lot of good things, things that will impact the city long term, and a lot of good capital investment. So expanding forward to Bristol County. Bristol County ARPA was 100% used for water and wastewater. So this funded purely water and wastewater efforts, again, to mitigate increases to the rates, to fund some of those really important capital projects that were in the CIP, would have been in the rate model, and really would have been needed to fund it. We have a lot of aging infrastructure, especially those water mains, and having the opportunity to use outside funds to fund those water mains was significant for the city. So we were unable to be awarded 100% of the funds, but I think we're at about 99%. So again, we were entitled to, based on the per person allocation, the per capita allocation, we were entitled to just under $7,930,000. We were awarded just under $7,910,000. Of those projects, we obligated $7,530,000 by December 31st, 2024, for all of those outstanding projects. And then again, anything that on those open projects, like change orders after that, we have to use internal city funding for. So that's an example of where that obligation and expenditure deadline is pretty challenging. You can have a project that spans 3 years. You can have change orders, things that come up later, and you have to deal with that with your own funds when there's sort of a timeline that's separate. There was contingency in these projects, and the turn back to the county at this point is under 5%. As you know, we usually have about a 10 to 15% contingency on projects, so it's not the most surprising thing. Any questions on this? All right. So looking at expenditures across the general government budget, Health and Human Services is really where the biggest increase in the budget was, and that's primarily due to solid waste. And then we also had a very significant increase in education, 7.9% increase. Again, a lot of that's driven by enrollment and Chapter 70. And then general government, the biggest change here is really the health insurance. So health insurance, as well as contractual and sort of salary changes, and some utility costs across the city. Contributory retirement, there was a change in the funding schedule. They just recently completed an actuarial for the next 2 years that adjusted the funding schedule and the contribution each year. The effect for the general government side was actually a little bit lower than the effect for like the schools, water and wastewater. I believe the actual funding schedule was closer to a 6% increase per year, but the change from last year to this year on the general government side, our share was a little bit smaller. Public safety, 4.6% increase, and then culture and recreation, a 2.4% increase. Public works, debt service, and state and county charges are where we saw our biggest decreases in the operating budget. State and county charges, that's a good thing. That means we're sending less money back to the state and back to the county. Public works, that's really related to the positional freezes until November that we've discussed, and the one position that was that went unfunded. It's been vacant for some time, and it's unfunded at this point, but that's a position that we've had a couple years with funding turned back every year into free cash, so we're sort of evaluating that. And then debt service was an increase, a little bit of an increase to the excluded debt, and then obviously the debt that we talked about falling off, of just over $500,000. As we've talked about, health insurance is one of the biggest driving forces right now in terms of budgetary increases. It's challenging for everyone, really across the state and private sector, public sector, across the board. And we're really certainly not immune to it, even being self-insured. We have additional ways to mitigate the impacts because we're self-insured, but it doesn't mean we're immune to the, rising cost of prescription drugs and so forth. Also, FY26 is,
Take a question from the Vice President, please.
absolutely.
Thank you. So the Public Works, are you talking about the assistant super position?
Correct. So it was, we haven't been able to hire for that position, so just given that consideration, we sort of put not a freeze, but sort of delayed the hire for that position until November. The position that I'm talking about is one of the lower HEO positions, I believe. We've had some vacant HEO positions.
And will that be reassessed in November as well?
That position won't be reassessed immediately, but definitely reassessed throughout the budget year. It's not sort of the first priority compared to like the foreman at Parks and Rec, but it's definitely a top priority. They need support over there to operate Public Works. So we're definitely reevaluating that. I think the priority there is really the assistant and the sort of the higher level position, and then the position that went purely unfunded would be sort of the next in that.
Yeah, I think bodies in general, so I'd hate to see that fall off the radar. So hopefully we can revisit that come November.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So Mason, if I can just ask a follow-up, because I share the concern raised by the Vice President. So when we're saying that it's kind of like a hiring freeze on this position until November, is that when, the job postings will go out and then we do the interviews? And, because my concern is just the timing, especially being
Absolutely.
in New England in November, it seems as though that would be a time that we would already want this individual to be onboarded.
Right, so in terms of actually funding for a position like that, the funding is budgeted up front for at least that 7 months.
Yep.
If things change with new growth and we have a better picture of the budget, we can also send down for additional funding. But unless there's other vacancies and sort of budget funding that becomes available in the department, it would really require a vote of the municipal council, in that we'd sort of be increasing the liability to that department, and we wouldn't want to look to hire earlier than what was budgeted for without approval. So unless there's sort of vacancies and available funding, or we know the funding picture's changed and we can send down a request to council, that's sort of the structure there. Is it's basically a delayed hiring.
Understood. I think to Vice President Dolan's point, and to Councilor Tavares, who's flying solo on the Finance Committee this evening, I would like to see that as part of the budget message, if you could pass that along. Thanks, sir.
All set? So debt service, just to circle back on this, again, we've sort of been consistently hovering at about 2.2 to 2.3% of operating budget, and this year we're at about 1.5%. So again, we took action to mitigate the impacts of that. Going forward, we do have debt coming off, but we also have authorized unissued projects that, depending on the timing of a delivery of an ambulance or a fire engine, there's all of a sudden a large debt number that comes onto the budget. So it's also very tactical in that we're not just saying, okay, 500,000 fell off this year, we can pick up 500,000 next year. That's not the approach. We're the city finance team, obviously under the direct supervision of the city treasurer. We look to time the market, make sure that we're actually under good borrowing conditions, that we're funding the projects at the appropriate time, and we work with our financial advisor to do that. Cape and Park Zoo. I think it's an important conversation for the public hearing. We talked about it a little bit the other night. The administration sort of taken a new financial management approach with the zoo in FY26. I know the headline in the paper was the parks budget was cut in half. That's because the zoo budget has been pretty much 50% supported by the park and forestry budget. One of the challenges with that is in terms of actually calculating the cost and the amount that's supporting the zoo. It's relatively difficult when you're sort of blurring the problem in the park and forestry budget. So we've separated out into its own org, sort of like an own department, the Cape and Park Zoo, for the general fund contribution side. So now it'll be a lot easier to sort of look at those independently and sort of have better historical records, and also just inform the conversation going forward. In terms of staffing over the last 3 years, the zoo had 15 full-time funded positions in FY24. Went through some sort of positional changes, elevating some positions, recognizing positions that weren't necessary or didn't meet the operational needs, under the direction of the new zoo director. And a lot of those positions have sort of changed over the last couple of years. The result of that is 13 full-time positions. But in this budget, the city's general budget is taking on the larger share of that. So for the first time in a number of years, couldn't tell you the last time, the city's general government is actually taking on a larger share of operating Capron Park Zoo than the zoo revolving fund. So that's a significant shift. Historically, the conversation's been largely, 35 to 40% of the zoo's operating budget is sort of from the general budget. It's the case now that it's over 50%. So the zoos.
Mason, if I could, to that, it goes back to a question or a point you made about insurance. That's a pretty big jump. How much of that is contractual? How much of that is rising healthcare costs?
In terms of the shift from the 550 to the 679?
Yeah.
So you'll see the difference just number-wise from positions 9 to 10 funded. We also shifted, the highest paid position at the zoo over to the general fund. And we switched off of the 50-50 positions that we had. Instead, we made it, you'll see it in the salary sheet, we tried to make it very clear the positions that are in the general fund, the positions that are in the revolving fund. The 679 is purely the salary number. The remaining number that I think it was 905 I had in the budget, that includes benefits, other fringe, essentially for the positions funded in the budget.
And for those at home, what does it mean when you take salaries out of the revolving fund? What's the impact that has on the zoo? And what does that revolving fund actually entail?
Yeah, absolutely. So the revolving fund is a revolving fund is under state statute a fund where revenues and expenses for a certain operation go in and out of. So the zoo has operating expenses and it has operating revenues. So the revolving fund is where essentially the council votes an expenditure cap, and then the zoo is allowed to live within that cap in terms of expenses. We can always revisit if revenues are going up, down. It can always be changed on a year-to-year basis, in mid-year as well. And so the revolving fund in the city for the zoo supports the direct operations of the zoo. So for us, it's really important that we evaluate the revenues year to year, and we're realistic about those revenues, which if you look at sort of the last, since 2017, fiscal year 2017, the last time we had an operating year where we actually had more revenues than expenses, we haven't been realistic about those revenues. We've definitely over-leveraged the amount of expenses that are being covered out of the revolving fund. And we've paid the price in that now the net operating cash in the revolving fund is not high enough to sustain 12-month operations, definitely not even 6-month operations. We're really at about 3 to 4 months of operating cash. The zoo is really cyclical. During the winter months, people aren't necessarily going to the zoo, and they can go 3 to 4 months, even 5 months, really without bringing in any revenues. So in order to meet payroll, contractual obligations, any other expenses, they need at least 5 months of operating cash just to make it through those winter months. And that's, I think it's easy to say in fiscal 2020, it started from the pandemic. You see the $470,000 sort of loss, as you could say, in fiscal 2020. But remember, we infused $470,000 of ARPA funds to offset that, right? And we've really continued down the same path. The average annual loss, excluding fiscal 2020, is $166,000. So since fiscal year 2017, we haven't actually had a year where we've done better than zero. There's also rising costs that the zoo deals with, right? So if they have full-time salaries over there, health insurance, benefits, everything being funded out of the revolving fund, and they're not raising their prices or they're not raising additional revenues, finding alternate revenue sources, essentially costs are going up and their revenues aren't.
I think that's an important point, so thank you for expounding upon that. Councilor Lavoy.
Thank you, President Delicio. Could you just touch on fiscal year 24 for the zoo? Looks like about $31,000 of a loss. What did we see that improved there? Because I think, given last week, the picture painted is it's getting worse every year, but, we've seen a dramatic drop, so, or I should say increase in revenue.
So I think what you saw in fiscal 24, I think there were some special events that were really successful. It was actually, if you look at the revenues, it's been one of the better years since 2017. I think it's in the top 3 since the last time we've had sort of a profitable year. The important thing to recognize, though, too, is the actual expenditure cap for fiscal 24, I believe, was about 1.1 million. So the zoo could have continued to expend funds, and if they didn't have vacancies in fiscal 24, which I believe in 24 we had a director vacancy for potentially 6 months. I mean, it was a significantly long vacancy, which is the highest paid position. We had a number of vacancies, which sort of closed the gap between the 1.1 million to that 990,000.
And then, so, correct me if I'm wrong, the new cap is 975?
We're recommending 875.
875, so technically speaking, if they stayed on track, they're profitable.
Technically speaking, if we see that going forward, this would sort of be a sustainable model if all things remained equal. Definitely sustainable for the zoo. Whether or not it's sustainable for the city's budget is another question, right? When when you have other positions that are going unfunded to sort of close the gap somewhere else, it's unfortunately it can be a zero-sum game sometimes. So that's sort of the discussion point that the city has to make. The other piece you heard a lot of the other night is that one of the challenges the zoo faces is it has a significant amount of capital expenditure that it needs. It needs a lot of upgrades. If I think your question is okay, is it now sustainable at this operating level? In theory, yes, but does attendance continue to drop because you continue to not put additional money into new exhibits and other areas to reinvigorate the guest experience? So it's still, while the operating expenditure cap is 875,000, or that's what we're recommending, there's still additional expenditures that the zoo would really need to sort of reinvigorate the effort. So I think all of that's part of the big conversation about how do we move forward. And then also with the 875, if the zoo's on track and doing better than that builds up the cash on hand and creates opportunity for us to make those capital investments, right? So if we see revenues really coming in, we can evaluate the expenditure cap and say, hey, this might be an opportunity for the zoo to take on debt for a project, right? That would open up a new exhibit or improve parking or improve, like they did the entrance, like things like that. So 875 is a conservative and kind of meets the historical expectations over the last 5 years. And I think actually gives them the opportunity to sort of move forward. But I think big picture, the city still needs to evaluate, where do we go from here? Because the 26 budget looks very different for the zoo than prior years. And it also has trickle-down effects on the rest of the budget.
Yeah, and I certainly don't negate that, and I understand, even if this was a profitable figure, even at 100K a year, the capital improvement needs are far beyond that in terms of getting funding for those. But I think I just wanted to paint somewhat of a brighter light to folks at home, because last week was obviously pretty tough for most listening in, so I think there is some positive, how that all works out in the bigger picture to be determined, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the effort here it was out of necessity, but also to buy the zoo time to figure out, to buy the city time to figure out what's the best path forward. We've kind of tried to do the same thing and kicked the can over the last, since FY 2017, and I think this is really us saying, okay, we're making significant action here by taking this approach. Whether or not that's what we do going forward, we need to, continue to discuss and make that decision, but at least this gives us time to do that.
Thank you.
So we pretty much hit on it, but big picture is we sort of have all options on the table, right? Are we gonna further fund the zoo on the general fund, continue the approach that was in FY 26, which could potentially require additional operational cuts, or cuts to other departments or other opportunities elsewhere? Do we reimagine the zoo operations, right? There's all different types of zoo in the state of Massachusetts, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You have plethora of municipal zoos, and they all look very different. We have some next door to us that are very different style, right? So that's on the table, right? Do we change the service and offerings that are available at the zoo? Also on the table is potentially privatizing the operation of the zoo. There's been demonstrated interest on that front, and there's clearly economic opportunity with the zoo, and the question that it's not just the question of can we fund the zoo and can the zoo fund itself, it's also the question of is the city best equipped to drive the most economic development and most benefit to the city by operating it? Or is potentially another operator actually more equipped to drive further benefit to the city, residents, businesses? So that's part of the conversation as well. And then obviously you have to consider, potential closing, right? If long-term the zoo is not the direction that the city wants to go, or it's not going to be a sustainable operation, at some point that decision has to be made, because just to unwind a zoo operation and move animals off site, you could be looking at 2, 3, 4 years, and a significant amount of costs just to do that. So there's also unwinding costs. So that's when we say, that's sort of the last option, right, in terms of what we want to do, but at some point you have to confront that as well. So that's, realistically all options are on the table, and we have to take a hard look at everything. So I think, in addition to the zoo being one of the big anticipated challenges, I think just going forward, health insurance is significant. The expiration of ARPA and other pandemic-related funding is significant. We managed to sort of mitigate that with the school department with ESSER funds, and it'll be an effort to do the same thing over here. We have sort of a sustained high interest rate environment. It's unclear in terms of the rate cuts on the short-term rates how that impacts us the long-term rates. You kind of see in the housing market things are all over the place. The rising cost of utilities, not just electric, heat, also our own utilities. Aging buildings and facilities, which are require significant capital expenditures, and then kind of expanding on the expiration of ARPA funds, just the overall uncertainty around federal funding as it relates to various grant opportunities, with some of which we've discussed, and other programs that provide funds to the city in the form of a grant.
Councilor Waterman.
Thank you. So I recall that Congressman Auchincloss had announced about a year ago that we would be eligible for one of those grants that goes to the district that get distributed through the congressman or congresswomen. So that was, I had been told originally that it would get announced around December after last fall's elections. Do we know whatever happened to that?
Or do you know which piece of funding you're referring to?
It was for the Council on Aging.
For the Council on Aging, I don't have an update on that in front of me. I could certainly speak to someone, try to get an idea. I haven't heard any movement on that, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then can step away and look for other members of the public.
Thank you. Any questions for Mason before we let him off the hook for this part of it? All right, Mason, thank you. We'll see you in a few. Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Do we have anyone to speak in favor? Do we have anyone to speak against? Do we have anyone to speak neither for nor against? Seeing none, Councilor Tavares, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open?
I do not.
Okay. So, Madam Clerk, we go on to reading the fourth public hearing.
Sure. Public hearing relative to the proposed fiscal year 2026 water and wastewater enterprise budgets.
Do we have anyone to speak in favor? We do. We know.
All right, I'm back.
We just went through the process.
Mason Lord, City Director of Budget Administration, 181 County Street, speaking in favor. Again, have further presentation prepared. I know there's a lot of members in the audience for other public hearings, so I'll try to speed run it a little bit more. I can get a little long-winded. But obviously, these are two really important departments in the city, and the enterprise budgets are extremely important, and there's significant long-term impacts of the discussions we're having. So first, sort of in order of the budget book, I think it makes sense to talk about wastewater. The biggest factors in the wastewater budget, the primary factor in both budgets would be the reserve for the new treatment plant. That's a new reserve that's been added to both budgets to build capacity within the budget and the rate for the debt that we anticipate in the coming years. We do anticipate for wastewater, sort of first potential year that debt could come on to the budget, being in FY29, FY30, now that we have movement on the new permit. And as we've discussed, the sort of estimates at this point are in the $150 million range. So as we move forward and review the permit and review the needs and then move into sort of the initial stages, there's going to be a lot of expenditures with that. The wastewater budget just in the operating budget is actually sort of a relatively modest increase of only about 6.2%, consistent with many of the other departments that we just highlighted. That's considering salary increases and the 15% health insurance rate increases, the retirement increases. So in terms of the actual increase in the operating budget, it's relatively modest in comparison. There was a 17.7% decrease or fall off in the debt service. That's a piece we separate out from operating, which is about, I believe, $482,000, if I remember correctly. So a lot of debt that is falling off. At this point, we're sort of in between treatment plants. So there's a lot of improvements that it wouldn't really make sense for the city to endeavor to at the treatment facility while we're sort of moving into the stage of potentially building a new one. So you'll notice in the CIP as well, when you compare water and wastewater, the number of projects sort of in the queue it's significantly smaller. And that's really just because at this point, I think, we pretty much agree that we'd be throwing good money after bad. We're sort of just at the end stages, and our permit is going to completely supersede what we're doing at the plant now. So that permit, we've been waiting since like 2013. It showed up, and now we have to figure out how to comply, right? So a lot of this is driven by federal regulations, and we're sort of ordered to comply with those, and obviously we want to have good treatment facilities, good infrastructure, and ensure that we're providing a good public health service as well to the public, and that's sort of derived from that permit. So within that reserve for new treatment plant, about half of that is really the debt that's falling off. Sort of the similar approach you saw in the general government budget is trying not to lose that capacity. Without that, we'd really be looking at a no increase in wastewater, right? But we also know that we have a $150 million facility in front of us, and if we don't sort of adjust our rates accordingly over the next 4 or 5 years, we'll be in a position where we would be doubling the rate overnight just to make those payments and ensure that we can afford the facilities that are in front of us. So the approach is really recommending continuing to build the reserve and sort of an approach of about 10% per year until FY 2029. So rather than 100% overnight, sort of smoothing out the process, making a little bit less rate shock, and sort of having a predictable opportunity for the residents and businesses. Other factors, material and chemical cost increases, also usage. So, it is a usage rate. We have other revenue sources with wastewater, but it is a usage rate. So when you're in water restrictions, which a lot of the rate for wastewater is driven by water usage, that does affect things. For wastewater, about 3% behind what we anticipated, which could result in a revenue shortfall there. There are other revenues to the wastewater fund in terms of permits, septic charges, other things of that nature that definitely close the gap in terms of wastewater's rate, which helps. But we do anticipate a little bit of a shortfall. But it is important to note that the FY26 budget isn't built on the usage of FY25. That's not how we structure things. The approach is sort of take a 3 to 5 year average of our usage and use that as sort of our approach for how we determine our rate. That ensures that we have both high years and low years built into the rate, so it's a little bit more robust. So when we have those higher years, our rate's not too low and we're not coming back for emergency rate increases mid-year. And when we have those high usage years, we're not shifting the rate too low, or we're not shifting the rate too high in response to 1 year. Because in this year, if we responded to FY25, we would be asking for a rate increase just to cover the 6.2. Instead, we're asking for a rate increase to build capacity for the new plant. Are there any questions on sort of the summary page? All right. The industrial pretreatment program. So as you're all aware, this is intended to cover the cost of the IPP. I can wait till the proper public hearing if you want me to hold that.
You know what, I think if the council's fine with this, I think it makes sense for you just to finish the presentation.
Perfect.
And we can apply it to the others. You can still get up and say you're in favor, but I think it just makes sense.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So in terms of IPP surcharge usage per year, it's about 9.4 million cubic feet of our, so sort of not just in what you would call an industrial user, but an industrial pre-treatment user. So I don't want the misnomer of, hey, these are industries. It's industries, but it can also be commercial or residential, less so residential, but folks that are permitted as industrial users because the nature of, you know, the waste that they create or the amount of usage. So it's not just, you know, because you're zoned industrial that you're being charged the IPP surcharge. So that's an important clarification. One of the reasons there's a hearing in front of you for just the IPP surcharge and you don't see a residential and industrial rate is because we've been calling that, but that's incorrect. And it's sort of been in two places in the ordinance. So we don't want people to think that we're charging, you know, the surcharge in two different places. So we have a wastewater rate and we have an IPP surcharge. So sort of correcting that within the ordinances this year. And that's why you see a little bit of a different vote than prior years. So trying to make that correction and point of clarity. The reason I think it's important is because it is directly related to the program, and that's how we isolate out the costs, right? We have personnel that they specifically are supporting these operations between the industrial pretreatment officer and then the assistant officer, which we only take, I believe, 40%. I can verify that, but it's only about 40% of their time. And then, you know, we're essentially backing that out of what's raised on the normal rate because we're raising it in a surcharge for those users where if we didn't have those users, we wouldn't have this program. So this is about a 60 cent increase from last year. One of the biggest differences is, you know, in our industrial usage has changed over the last 3 to 5 years. We've actually had folks change their operations, some of our industries, where they now don't fall under pretreatment because of just the waste they're producing. So we now have actually have less users and less usage on that front. Also, some of the industries have become more efficient in terms of their processing, so they've actually reduced their footprint significantly. So where it used to be closer to 13 million cubic feet a year, it's now about 9.5. So the proposed wastewater rate, as discussed, we're recommending a 10% increase. This is a little bit of a deviation from last year where we had said that, hey, we're probably expecting a 12.3 to 12.5 over the next 3 years. The reason being is now that we actually know where the permit is instead, and we kind of know what we're on track to sort of take on in FY29. We're recommending instead flattening that out to 10% over the next 5 years. So that's sort of a different approach rather than front loading it while we're also dealing with even more significant increases in water, sort of smoothing that out. And that's why having a multi-year rate model is advantageous, right? We can make those recommendations, consider those options, and actually plan long-term, and also consider, you know, where are costs going up in other places as well. So the recommended rate going from $11.81 to $12.99. Again, consistent with historical practice, we would phase that in because, you know, it's for usage after July 1. It's not for billing after July 1. So looking ahead, this graph represents that 10% per year. So you see in FY 2030, and between FY 29 and FY 2030 is where we expect those costs to come on. This proposed rate gets us there. So we're really being deliberate in our approach. And you'll notice the debt service, the current debt service, you can really see it trailing off over the next few years. That's consistent with what I had mentioned earlier, where there's just a lot less for us to be doing in the existing plant while we're waiting for a new plant. So our debt service will continue to trail off, and the goal would be to continue to pick up and build the reserve in place of that debt service that falls off so that we can put ourselves in a position to pay for a new wastewater treatment plant without, you know, a 80 to 100% increase overnight. We all set with wastewater. Take any questions? Good to go?
Council Sawyer?
So I just have a question, actually a concern, because nobody's incomes go up that much, and paying for this even over 5 years, you know, is, I would say, a hardship, you know, to ratepayers. And I wonder, is there any other way to put money towards this that helps the ratepayers other than raising rates? And just to kind of figure that out, whether, I mean, you said the debt service is going down, and when we're building up the stabilization fund, just like all these other things, is there any other way to help that?
Absolutely. So it's a great question. The actions we took the last few years were significant in supporting that. So part of the reason the debt service is falling off is because rather than borrow for, different wastewater projects, we got about $4 million in ARPA funds that supported wastewater, right? Those are things that we would have borrowed for, 15, 20-year borrowings would have been paying for the next 15, 20 years, and we're not going to be doing that. So that was significant effort to mitigate the increase to the rates. And water was even more significant, right? Closer to 7 or 8 million in total. So really, that was definitely a calculated approach, and I think that was a collaborative effort between the administration and the council, and the past administration was taking that same approach. The important thing to keep in mind, and I've reiterated this before, is that the reason we have user rates is because not everyone in the city is a user of the water and wastewater system. With the scenario you bring up, there's ultimately the fallback to us not supporting the water and wastewater is that the taxpayer as a whole has to make it up. So if there is a deficit in the enterprise funds, the place we have to go if we are unsuccessful in raising the rates is to the taxpayer. So it has to come onto the budget. So you're cutting city services elsewhere to fit it in the gap, or you're looking out to the city for a Prop 2.5 override or some other sort of exclusion to essentially find an alternate revenue source for, again, there's many folks in the city and that are not on the system. So it's a user charge for that specific reason. I know that's a difficult answer to the question because I understand the point entirely, and I think that's why when we said the 10% per year rather than another 13% here, 13% next year, along with the water rates that are in front, is trying to smooth that out. Also trying to avoid an FY 2030 80 to 100% increase when it's obviously folks' incomes aren't rising 10% per year, but they're definitely not rising 80 to 100% per year.
Councilor Lavoy.
Thank you, President Delicio. Could you touch on the impact of, and I know this might be challenging, but the impact of each percentage point on that increase? I know we're looking at 11%, but if we came back and it was 8%, 9%, what type of impact are we looking at on that? Let's say 3% shift or 2% shift.
Yeah, so I could certainly run, if you're looking at it on a percentage basis, I could certainly run the percentages for you. We do usually look at it more on a 1 cent basis. So there's a reason sort of the 1 cent is written, like 1 cent of rate generates X is written into the budget, because if you were to cut the rate by, X number of cents, it's sort of a multiple of that. There's some rounding involved because we're dealing with millions of cubic feet down to dollars. But that's sort of the multiple that you could use. So for example, I believe you saw that the 1 cent of wastewater rate generates approximately $8,812, right? So a reduction from $12.99 in the rate to $12.98 means that somewhere in the budget you have to cut $8,812. As well, if it's anything that's operating, you also have to cut the general government budget. So if it's excluded, if things that are cut are excluded from the rate, from the indirect cost model, which is laid out clearly on that summary page, cuts there do not impact the general government budget. But if you cut the operating budget, because the indirect costs are charged to the operating budget, you also have to make cuts on the general fund. So that's important. I know it's a long-winded answer, but I can also run it on a percentage basis if you have specific questions, but you can pretty much use that number and sort of multiply it out.
I think what I'm alluding to more, I guess, is the financial plan on a new treatment plant. If we bring this number back to what we view as more favorable for the ratepayer, to lessen the burden, if we bring this down to, like I said, that 8-9% figure, what is the long-term impact? Do we foresee a bigger impact? Is it something if maybe we save a percentage point each year, but our target of a new plant shifts a year out to kind of balance that? Is that foreseeable? I think when we're deciding such an increase, and I would say the focal point is really one end goal of a treatment plant, I think it's important to kind of have the context of, where do we sit if we move that rate around? You know, obviously, I think everyone's goal is to be better to the ratepayer. So finding that common ground and seeing kind of what the implication would be either way, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, the way the model is designed is, essentially we can rebuild this model, the entire model, and shift it just based on the percentage of the rate increase. So, part of the reason is, the goal of this is to get to that sort of operating not in deficit by the time a new treatment plant would come online. If things changed, right, permitting changed, et cetera, in year 2 of this plan, we could certainly adjust, right? That was kind of what you saw this year, right? We're not going to just, if things remain equal, the goal would be to move forward as planned. But if things don't remain equal and things get pushed out a year, then we would then smooth it out over an additional year, right? So you might take on 10% this year, gets pushed out to 2031, and you're looking at 7 to 8% over the next 4 years rather than 10, 10, 10, 10. So that, that's something we would continue to reevaluate every year. The concern is if you don't front load some of it, you're actually chasing it later, right? So 10% this year is more like 11% next year if you don't do it, right? So you drop to 9, you're looking at, to make sort of the equivalent increase, you're more like 11 next year. So you're sort of chasing the rate. That's one of the challenges we've had in the city historically is there's been years where, operating expenses have gone up a lot and we've just cut things to zero out the rate, and then we're deferring maintenance, we're deferring other things, and then you were subsidizing it, and now you're picking up the subsidy and increasing it. So because last year we actually subsidized the rates to get down to the increases we were at. So now we're sort of actually part of the increase this year is building in that we subsidized last year. So we have to now make up for that. So that's part of that multi-year approach.
Councilor Fowl.
Thank you, President Lucio. Am I right that we don't have discretion to extend when the new plant has to come online? That the NEPD's permit requires a particular date? Is that correct?
So I think it's a good follow-up question for Superintendent Hayes on Thursday in terms of the timing of it, but I understand there's usually compliance orders. And if they issue a compliance order, what can also happen is if you don't comply, you get put on a no build, and the whole city can go on no build, no development, everything goes on freeze. They're allowed to do that. So that's obviously like last resort. But if you don't comply with the NIPD's permit, my understanding is that essentially everything can kind of be grinded to a halt. So I would definitely recommend on Thursday maybe bring that question up to the superintendent, and then also the planning and planning director might be, Gary might be a good person to ask about that as well.
Thank you.
So water, a little bit more challenging in terms of the rate that's in front of us, and that's because the treatment plant is really upon us. What different from wastewater is that the operating side of the budget is an 11.1% increase. The biggest factors there, you saw the 6.2 on wastewater. The biggest factor in sort of that gap is really the start of a hydrant maintenance plan, which is really just infant at this point. We only put about $100,000 in the budget to address that, and we're looking at closer to $300,000 to $400,000 a year that needs to be probably brought onto the budget. I think the new water superintendent, Dennis Morton, has been on, and he immediately kind of worked with the fire department to really kind of put a plan together and identified some of the issues that we were sort of lacking in, and was able to actually give an idea of what this looks like. And that's something that wasn't built into the rate model, right? So it's another expense that we're sort of looking at in front of us that really needs to be addressed, because the number one reason why we have a water department is for firefighting. And so I know that's something that, the fire department's really put an emphasis on is, hey, these need to be addressed. And I think you've seen it around the city just in the last few weeks, just some of the regular preventative maintenance, but a lot need to be replaced. So that's sort of a new cost where, again, we only built about $100,000 in, but that's probably a percentage point or plus in there. Additionally, what's coming up too is the lead service replacements. That was something that Dennis had identified right away. Something I wasn't aware of is that starting in fiscal 27, we have to replace 10% of our lead services per year. I don't think that was something that was really on the radar, and kind of put that on the radar immediately. So that's something we need to plan for and rebuild into the model. But 10% per year starting in FY '27 is, another potentially 600,000 because it's about 200. My understanding is about 200 services per year, which is significant. And those residents will also likely incur costs as well. So that's something to, put on folks' radar. That's not in here. So that's another piece that, like, at some point, the rate's going to have to take on. 15% health insurance, the water department is taking on, just like the other departments. It's obviously significant. They also had an over $528,000 debt fall off. So half of the reserve fund for treatment is scooping up that debt fall off to make sure we're not losing it, because at fiscal year '27 is when we expect the first costs related to the new treatment plant to come online. So we'll, that first $15 million tranche of funding, the expectation is once it's half expended, they actually go out and borrow for it. So we would potentially immediately have principal and interest, depending on where they come back with the interest, but we potentially immediately have principal. At least we would probably have short-term financing. So we're anticipating costs coming on immediately next year. That's when it's a $40 million project over 2 years, it's $7 million is not a very long time on a scale of a project like that, so we're anticipating FY '27. We've got confirmation this year that we won't have anything coming on the budget in '26. At least we're relatively confident, but part of having this reserve for new treatment plan is if costs do come on for the facility, because we're sort of at the will of SRF and how they borrow, we would have a place to go if that did happen. So that's another component of that. Obviously, material and chemical costs, and then a little bit more felt than wastewater would be the usage, sort of just being behind in the revenues related to water restrictions and everything in that front. We were anticipating a revenue shortfall at about after the first 2 quarters of about $450,000. That was why, to sort of mitigate that, we infused we shifted $500,000 of water salaries over to ARPA. Was basically it looked at the usage and how far behind we were, and sort of essentially take that cost off of needing to do a new a mid-year rate increase or hurting essentially the water enterprise fund long-term and their ability to fund capital and the retained earnings. We shifted that to ARPA at sort of the 11th hour, which really mitigated the impact to the enterprise, and also we don't now have to pick that cost up in this year. So that was a very deliberate effort. And again, similar to wastewater, we're not using FY '25 usage as our usage base. We're using the 3-year average, which included a high year, has included a sort of a medium and a little bit of a lower year. This year was obviously the lowest so far in years, and we're not including that. So that's sort of where this all comes from. Any questions on this? So big picture, consistent with what was recommended last year, recommending an 18% increase. That would bring the rate from $719 to $848. And, Councilor Voida, responding again to your question earlier, 1 cent of rate would generate approximately $14,678. That's about the same usage rate as last year. So we really haven't, with that 3-year average, we haven't really seen a significant decrease. Maybe, maybe a million. I think it was less than 1 million cubic feet. So again, consistent with historicals, we would phase this rate increase in.
Before we move on, does anyone have questions on the water rate? Mason, I have one. So given everything that happened last summer, I think it would be disingenuous if we didn't at least have this discussion. To raise the water rate, I think we need to flush out, pun intended, what the impact of what happens if we vote to keep it the same this year. I think in a year where we had a lot of the restrictions, which a lot of it were based on the state, I get that, but we lost a lot of water. We had to pay a lot of money in water usage from other municipalities. What's the impact if this council said, you know what, I think for at least this year, we're keeping it as is?
Yeah, I think you'd be looking at about at least like a 10% cut to the department. So you'd probably be cutting about 10% of the department. You would definitely not be able, we'd be looking at like a 40% increase next year to cover the debt that's in front of us for the new facility. And then additionally, just to sort of respond to the piece like you had said about the buying from other communities, we really did make a significant effort to take that impact off of the ratepayer by shifting it onto ARPA, right? So I think in total, we purchased under 400,000 worth of water from surrounding communities, and we infused 500,000 basically to offset that expense. So that was it was basically the city saying, hey, we recognize this issue, things happened, and the city's trying to mitigate that impact. And the rate increase here is not a result of that. That was untreated water, right? So in short, there wasn't the cost essentially of treating the water. A lot of the water departments operations are fixed costs. So it wasn't treated water, so there weren't like chemical costs and things there. The cost would really be in terms of, you had water restrictions, and then ultimately revenues that wouldn't meet the anticipated revenues, but that's why we sort of took that approach, was to mitigate that to where the rate increase recommended is not a reflection of, hey, there was, a situation that happened and there was mistakes potentially on the city side, right? That, now the ratepayer is it's on the back of the ratepayer. We think the city really, committed by sort of making that contribution from available funds to mitigate that impact.
So no judgment by any stretch,
course.
but I mean, it would be disingenuous if we didn't have this discussion.
Of course.
I think a lot of us are sitting here thinking that, it's kind of the timing, it doesn't fly in a lot of ways, but on the other side of the coin, I think, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot that we need to do, because if you look at the historical trajectory of the water rate, it was flat for a long, long time, which kind of put us behind that 8 ball too. So I think we have a lot to think about here. Councilor Boyd, did you have a question? And then Vice President Dolan?
Yes, thank you. Brief comment. I just want to point out that the $500,000 respectfully could have been allocated to other city projects if we didn't
100%.
have the issue. So I hate the notion of we shifted it off the taxpayer, because end of the day it's taxpayer money anyway, but it would have went to something else that would have saved another bill from the taxpayer down the road. But my question would be, do we have a percentage figure where we're kind of aiming to be at out of the total budget to what we're putting towards a treatment plant? I know we're at the 1.1 million figure. In my head, if we were to...
It's about 10%.
Okay, so if we came back in, if 7%, 8% in motion, or not motion, but hope to utilize free cash to offset the difference to then not have a 40% increase next year. I don't know the feasibility, obviously, but more so was curious of the percentage point that if we winded this down, tried to pillow the taxpayer's burden, where we're at, and see how, free cash can kind of offset. So 10% is perfect.
So a couple things. I was pretty specific in my language saying ratepayer, because it was a benefit to the ratepayer. It was not a benefit to the taxpayer, to your point, right? The taxpayer, those funds would have been available to benefit anyone in the city. By using that for water operations, we sort of benefited the ratepayer. So that's why I said ratepayer. That was, very particular. Additionally, so use of free cash, right? Those are directly resulting from the general government budget, right? So when you talk about taxpayer, ratepayer, you would be having if that was the approach, the taxpayer would be bailing out the enterprise system. So if that's the recommendation, right, that, ultimately it's not that it can't happen. If the city doesn't raise the rates and isn't able to pay its debt obligations or has catastrophically doesn't raise enough revenue, then it will fall on the taxpayer. But that would be taking it 2 steps forward to do that deliberately.
Vice President Dolan?
Thank you. So this rate, this new rate that you have here for water, this was generated from the rate study, correct?
Correct. With yes, actually it was 20 last year, 18. So this is consistent with that. And the only changes, like I said, that are coming are some of those new items that aren't in the CIP right now, that aren't capital expenses and operational expenses that we were really aware of until the last 6 months, that aren't sort of fixed into this model at this point. So the hydrant maintenance, the lead service line, stuff like that.
So you're saying that that's not in this percentage?
Correct.
But this percentage was born from the rate study that you presented. When did you present that?
Last year. Around budget last year, correct.
So then it was,
And then it's updated with FY26 expense, FY25 expenses, FY26 expenses. It's a living model that we continue to update. This is the recommendation to stay the course of last year because we've been pretty actually consistent with sort of the expenses we anticipated. So what was sort of built into the model for 26 really kind of matches, and then making up the gap is sort of building in that reserve for treatment plant to get us to actually covering the expenses. And you'll notice the way this is structured is in 28, 29, and 30, we're actually, the proposed revenue is actually lower than the anticipated expenses. That's because at this point, we do anticipate some potential savings on loan forgiveness, on principal forgiveness from SRF. So we're sort of assuming that we're going to get some of that. So I'm not building in, having to borrow for the entire cost of the project. If that changed, then the rates that are in front of you might actually not be enough. But we're pretty confident that we will get some of that forgiveness, and that we'll recognize some of that interest-free borrowing as well as principal forgiveness. So that's sort of factored in here. But if you look at it as a one-to-one, we're actually seeing a deficit in 28, 29, 30. But the expectation is we would get some of that back.
Thank you.
Councilor Tavares.
Mason, just, do you know if there have been discussions with the rate study consultant in the city regarding exploring maybe like tiered options for the rate, or playing around with those numbers? I almost don't even know what to ask in regards to that, but just curious if there's other models that have been explored for perhaps approaching this long term.
Yeah, 100%. So prior to actually doing a multi-year rate model, we had essentially a one-year rate where every year we look at our expenses, balance the rate to the revenues, and we had no future outlook, no past outlook, and no way to sort of build in capital planning. That's why you see, wastewater, the chart's a really good example, is pretty much in 2 years you saw a 300%, almost a 300% increase in like five years. So the rate jumped significantly, and that's what happens when you don't have a plan. I think the city, the next time we go out to do a rate model, because I really think similar to indirect costs, we should do it every 3 to 5 years. We should reevaluate, we should update, and then build in other options, look at other fees. I think we'll look at a tiered rate system as well. So potential changes there, but that's sort of we have to approach that from a starting point of zero. We've never had that in the city, with the exception of industrial, sort of the industrial surcharges and the permits that we have. We've never really had separate rates. So it would be a very new process, but we have the ability to do that.
Thanks, Mason.
Pending any questions, that concludes my comments.
Thank you, Mason. Thank you for taking the questions, and thank you for the presentation and your work on the budget.
Of course, thank you.
Do we have anyone else to speak in favor to this public hearing, which is relative to the proposed fiscal 26 water and wastewater enterprise budgets? Anyone to speak in favor? Anyone to speak against? Anyone to speak neither for nor against? Councilor Tavares, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open?
I do not.
Thank you. I declare that closed. And we'll go into the reading of the fifth public hearing.
Public hearing relative to the proposed solid waste fee of $358. This is a $33 increase in the fee from fiscal year 2025.
Thank you. Do we have anyone to speak in favor? Long time.
Mason Lohr, City Director, Budget Administration, 181 County Street, speaking in favor. This one I'll be relatively short on. The city underwent a competitive bid process for the first time with solid waste in decades, where we really went through a formal solicitation process, brought in multiple bidders, and essentially had them competing against each other. It was a really successful process. I think we feel really confident that we have the best price possible. Even at the 11th hour, one bidder was, cutting down their price to try to get in the door, but they still didn't get down to waste management. And we weren't sure on their status with the bins, so there was going to be other costs there. So I think we're really confident that we have the best price possible, and if not for the changes in prevailing wages related to sort of the Teamsters union rates up at the state, we would have actually had a lower solid waste rate this year than last year. So I think that represents again, it's unfortunate that, the prevailing wages have changed so much and went up like $15 an hour, and Cheryl can talk about that more, to where it actually yielded an increase. But we would have actually gone from the end of last contract to a new contract with a cut to the solid waste rate. That's how competitive the process was. So I think, if nothing else, we learned, this is the way to go. And I think every 5 years, we would definitely want to repeat this process, make sure we're getting the best bang for our buck. But I feel pretty confident that you can stand before the taxpayers and say, hey, we've got a good deal here.
Okay. Questions? Mason, any change to the blue barrels? I know that's a question we're gonna get.
So Cheryl Perry, our solid waste manager, can speak more about it on Thursday. My understanding from preliminary conversations is that in year 2, we are potentially looking to offer a larger barrel as a secondary option, working out the fee structure, how that would sort of work. But I think that the plan is, at least in year 2 or 3, to have that as an option, and we made that available through this process. So that's definitely, being reviewed. I would definitely recommend asking the solid waste manager kind of what that process looks like. But I know that's a big question, and I really do think it is coming. So.
Great. And then any change to the bags?
The bag fees, we're not recommending any change. I think we made that adjustment last year. I think we're confident where we're at, and we'll reevaluate that every year. But we're confident at the $250. That's why you didn't see a recommended increase there.
Great. Additional questions? Mason, thank you. Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Anyone to speak against? Do we have anyone to speak neither for nor against? Councilor Tavares, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open?
I do not.
That public hearing is closed. All right. And then, would you mind reading the?
Got it. Public hearing relative to the proposed water rate of $8.48 per 100 CF. This is a $1.29 increase in the rate from fiscal year 2025.
Thank you. Do we have anyone to speak in favor?
Mason Lord, speaking in favor. All my comments from before stand.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Do we have anyone to speak against? Do we have anyone to speak neither for nor against? Councilor Tavares, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open?
I do not.
I declare that public hearing closed. And Madam Assistant Clerk.
Public hearing relative to the proposed wastewater rate of $12.99 per 100 CF. This is a $1.18 increase in the rate from fiscal year 2025.
Anyone to speak in favor?
Mason Lord, speaking in favor. All my comments stand. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Anyone to speak against? Anyone to speak neither for nor against? Councilor Tavares, any reason to keep this public hearing open?
I do not.
Thank you. I declare that public hearing closed. We'll go on to the reading of the next public hearing.
Public hearing relative to the proposed wastewater industrial pretreatment surcharge of $2.08 per 100 CF. This is a 60-cent increase in the surcharge from fiscal year 2025.
Do we have anyone to speak in favor?
Mason Lord, Director of Budget Administration, speaking in favor. Just to reiterate, this is sort of a correction to the ordinances, making sure it doesn't live in 2 places, and clarifying that, hey, this is just for the industrial pretreatment program.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Anyone to speak against? Anyone to speak neither for nor against? Councilor Tavares, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open?
I do not.
Thank you. Declare that public hearing closed. And for the last public hearing relative to the budget.
Public hearing relative to the proposed 2% cost of living adjustment increase in the city's compensation plan for fiscal year 2026.
Thank you. Do we have anyone to speak in favor?
Mason Lord, speaking in favor. I will note this does impact my annual salary. I've done a disclosure on a potential conflict of interest and been cleared by my supervisor. So this, what has historically been referred to as the exempt employees, right? We went through the classification and compensation study and updated the classification and compensation plan. And this is kind of consistent with the conversations we had around that. COLAs will continue to be evaluated every single year, and the goal of the administration, at least this administration, and I think historically throughout the city, is to provide a COLA that's commensurate with the other collective bargaining groups in the city, and this does that. This meets sort of the kind of typical standard of meeting the clerical unions cost of living adjustment. So that was the approach, and again, consistent with sort of past discussions. Definitely recommend it.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Wood? Okay. Thank you, Mason. Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Anyone to speak against? Anyone to speak neither for nor against? Okay. Seeing none, Council Tavares, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing closed?
No, I do not.
I mean,
Keep it
open
open.
rather, keep it open rather. I apologize. I declare that public hearing closed. All right, we'll go on to the first public hearing, which will invite the planning board to join us. And for those who came a little later, we have suspended the rules just due to the timing, so we took the public hearings out of order. Good evening, Planning Board. Nice to see you all. Chair Whitehead. Assistant Madam Clerk.
Joint public hearing with the planning board regarding a proposed amendment to the hours of operation within section 17-10.15, item F.6 as follows. Marijuana retail sales or medical marijuana patient sales may not occur within the hours of 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. and may be further restricted as a condition of approval of the special permit issued by the special permit granting authority.
Thank you. Do we have anyone to speak in favor? Please come to the podium.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Michael Kachekian. I serve as the Director of Retail Operations for Zahara Cannabis at 70 Frank Mossberg Drive in Attleboro. Brief just introduction to myself. I've been in the industry for 10 years, working across 3 different states. Been actively working in Massachusetts market since December of 2021. And with me tonight is our Director of Security, Mike Allen, who will be available to address any security-related questions. But thank you again for the opportunity to speak in favor of amending the current bylaw to extend the operating hours for 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. To provide some background of our recent history, we went forth in front of the ZBA prior in about January 2024. We did receive approval to extend our hours from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. To 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. 3 days a week to start off. That did help change and generate incremental $40,000 per month additional revenue for us. We kind of did that for about 8 months and then came back to the ZBA to introduce extended hours for every day, 7 days a week. We did get approval by the ZBA again. Since that full extension, we have realized an additional $178,000 in monthly sales. We've been growing substantially month over month. And to date, since last year of the current performance, we've seen about a 55% increase in the extended hours from 8 to 11 p.m. That's about an average of $9,000 a day for us. And as of right now, as we heard earlier, seems like the competitive landscape right now, one of our competitors in Rhode Island is open until 1 a.m. So, in order to remain competitive and keep business coming back to Attleboro and prevent customers going back to Rhode Island, we would like to have the flexibility to match those hours. We do see a substantial amount of traffic through from Rhode Island. About 50-60% of our business is coming from the Rhode Island market. And from the city's perspective, that 3% local tax does generate roughly about another $8,000 per month for the city of Attleboro. Regarding public safety, we've had 0 incidents, no calls to law enforcement, no complaints from neighboring businesses or residents. We always maintain 24/7 surveillance. We have security, stringent access controls to ensure safety for both patrons. We have a great ongoing relationship with the city of Attleboro's police department. And then based off of that, for the marijuana local option tax, because of the steady increase that he mentioned earlier from the prior budget review, we definitely think we can add to that. And, we have been seeing growth month over month for that. So, yeah.
Questions? Mr. Lavoy.
Thank you, President Delicio. Would you see any, would you be concerned if there was to be any type of security requirement to this, having a licensed security officer on the premise during these set hours of adjustments. Would that hinge you from being able to be profitable for this, or is that something that could be feasible?
It is. I mean, we definitely will beef up security for those hours.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we'll hire just a security supervisor for the late hours. They'll have the proper equipment with them. They'll be surveying, keeping track of the cameras throughout the night. And right now, we haven't really had any issues with that to date. But obviously, with the later hours, we will make sure we are prepared for the security. And Mike Allen can elaborate on that as well.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, planning board. My name is Mike Allen, and I am the Director of Security for the company.
Can we just have your address for the record, please?
Home address is 47 Bailey Drive in Rochester, New Hampshire.
Thank you.
So just a little background on me. I've been with the company since the inception, the build out. I've worked in the industry now for about 8.5 years. Former law enforcement. I was a police chief in New Hampshire before I retired and began working as a consultant in the industry. So I work as a consultant for Zahara Cannabis as well. And, we've had an ongoing great relationship with the police department here. Chief Higney has been a great partner in terms of working with the company on various events that we've held, any security related issues that we've had in the past. We've always worked closely with him on addressing them. But to answer this question specifically related to security and what we're planning to have at the site, we have security now. But obviously, we not only do you, I'm sure, have concerns with security at that late hour, but even our employees do as well. So we want to certainly make our employees feel safe. We want to make our customers feel safe, and we certainly want to put any concerns of anybody in this room's issues that, we want to allay those concerns as well. So we want to make sure we beef up our security staff. So we'll have somebody there during those late hours every day as an additional person on top of what we already have is the plan.
Councilor Tavares?
Sure, I have two questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
President Delicio. So my first question was, actually, let me backtrack. Have you consulted with Chief Higney on this requested ordinance change?
I have, and he has voiced no concerns in terms of any opposition to it, and that's been his position on it. But I don't have anything official in writing from him.
Appreciate that. And then my second question was, you had mentioned earlier that there's at least one competitor in Rhode Island that's open till 1 a.m. Are there other competitors in Rhode Island that are open till 1 a.m. right now?
Not that I'm aware of. Mother Earth Wellness is the one that's open 3 days a week till 1 a.m. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. There are a bunch of others probably open till 11 p.m. at least, but I know of other states, dispensaries in Massachusetts too, that are trying to extend their hours.
Councilor Sawyer?
Hi, I just wanted to ask, because the way that the public hearing is written, that sales cannot be between 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. and you were just speaking about you want your hours to go until 1 a.m. But I was just thinking about how it's written, that's not going to go from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. So I'm just wondering what the intent, I guess, of that.
Yeah, currently we are open from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. With the amending of this bylaw, we were trying to open at 7 a.m. to 1 a.m.
I see.
I've got a question. Very simple. What's the need? I mean, having, a store like this open, and, I know you guys have been a great partner with the city and we appreciate it, but what's the need to be open till 1 o'clock, because, my grandmother always said, nothing good happens after 12 o'clock.
Right.
And we push that out an hour.
Of course.
A little concerning.
Of course. I mean, right now we are seeing the traffic till 11 p.m. regardless. And just to add the additional revenue for the city, I know, gentleman behind us earlier did bring up the marijuana local options tax, saying that has kind of stayed steady with business coming from Rhode Island. We've been getting a lot of business from Rhode Island, and I think we can contribute a lot to that.
Have you seen demand of people saying, man, I really wish you were open till 1?
Yes, sir.
It's a little concerning to me.
We there are bars and other places that are open usually pretty late, and we do get traffic. Obviously, again, security on point we have all the time, and we will beef up security into the later hours.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add to that? So being former law enforcement, obviously I'm familiar with these types of concerns and issues that come up during the late hours such as that. But I was a skeptic, to be honest with you, as well, when we first launched the additional hours that we were approved for back several months ago. And what we found was we haven't had any issues with between the hours of 8 and 11 p.m., which is what we were extended for each day. We haven't had any issues. So I understand the optics of it, and certainly I think a lot of things related to the cannabis industry, certainly from my perspective, have changed over the years. A lot of the fears and trepidation that I've had personally, just none of those fears or issues that I was concerned with have ever come to fruition. So I mean, past, I guess, experience is a good indicator of future, and so I think we would at least like the council and the board to consider a trial basis. If there are concerns about doing this long term, give it a chance and see, and we'll show you that if any concerns do arise, you can always put the brakes on it at some point. But that would be, I guess, what we'd like you to consider if there's that much trepidation with this.
Yeah, I think to your point, I got a comment and then a follow-up question, then I'll get to Mr. Lavoy. I think the companies that we have in the city, I think, have helped alleviate a lot of the fear and a lot of the concern. So it's not like 1934 with reefer madness, right? But the other concern I do have is there's still no real testing mechanism in place. So I guess my question, kind of unrelated, is, are you seeing more of a breakdown between medicinal users or recreational users?
More of a breakdown in terms of...
So if you're going to have extended hours, do you think it'll be recreational users or more people who need it for medicinal purposes?
I mean, we're a recreational dispensary, so do medical patients come into our dispensary? Of course they do.
Sure.
But I would say the large majority, and I think Mike would speak to this as well,
Yeah.
are recreational users. So
I will note, though, we have had customers from Rhode Island who are medical patients in Rhode Island shop with us because of the pricing. The Rhode Island market is a little bit higher price, so we have competitive pricing, we have a great loyalty program, and a lot of things in place to really help, get the customer what they want at a good price, and we do get a lot of patients from Rhode Island.
and if we wouldn't be standing here before you if we didn't think there was obviously benefit to not only the company but to the city in terms of tax revenue. So we feel that there is an opportunity here for customers based on the feedback that we've received that would like to shop that late.
Sure.
So I just wanted to add that additional feedback.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoy, then Council Follow.
Thank you, President Delicio. Just a brief comment well, I'll get to a question as well, but a comment to my previous question. And the reason for that was and I won't name them, and it's not your dispensary, but there's one that I've received a handful of complaints about for just various, urination on the property that abuts a business next door, trash. I have pictures of barrels full of trash that gets put in their dumpster. So while I understand, you're doing your due diligence, I don't think counterparts are, and so that's my concern, and that's the question of, would you still be okay if there was some constraints put onto this with security protocols, because I'm not comfortable in saying everyone else is, as secure as you. My question that I allude to would be, why the 7 days a week and not the 3 days that Rhode Island is doing? Are you hoping to be just more competitive in the other 4 days? Or could you do those 4 days and not the 3 days? Yeah.
I mean, we could, just like we did in the beginning, how we got approved for the first extended hours, we did it on a trial basis. They tested us because it was the exact same conversation. They were like, how are you going to see the hours? People are going to actually be shopping that late. And it was a complete opposite. So we tried that trial, did the 3 days, and then 8 months later, towards September of that year, we came back and provided data and showing all the numbers and how much we brought in, and we got approved for that. So I have no issue beefing up security, meeting those expectations from you, and even doing just the 3 days. We just threw Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, try it out.
Council Fellow.
Thank you. Can you tell us, please, what are the, what's the ordinance or whatever the proper term is in Rhode Island? What are the hours? Can they open at 7 a.m. in Rhode Island?
That I'm not 100% sure, but I know North Attleboro can open at 7 a.m. So like Native Sun in North Attleboro is open at 7 a.m. every day.
And when do they close?
They're closed at 11 p.m. Last time I checked, it was 10 p.m. on certain days and maybe 11 p.m. on like Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. But they are open till around 11 p.m.
Council Sawyer.
I wondered about, this, it's not the same as alcohol, but it is something that could put some people under the influence in some ways, and would later hours I would imagine, make this worse? I mean, alcohol places have to close at a certain time that's earlier than 1 a.m., and so I just wonder about the influence causes, of accidents or whatnot.
No, valid concern. What I will tell you is nobody under the influence is allowed to come into our facility. Not only is that policy for the company, but it's also a CCC regulation that we can't allow anyone under the influence of any substance, not just alcohol, into our facility and make a sale to them. We would simply deny them entry and call the police. We don't want someone driving off that's under the influence of alcohol.
But I'm sorry, but then also they're buying there, they could leave under the influence. I mean,
Well, that's what I'm saying. They wouldn't be allowed in. So if they came into our vestibule, we have when you first enter, you enter a vestibule. You can't get beyond that vestibule until you've had your identification checked and verified that you're over the age of 21. One of the things they do, our security staff, is screen people to ensure they're not under the influence. So if someone was obviously, it was obvious to them that was the case, they'd be denied entry.
Vice President Dolan.
Thank you. So I've been on tours, not your facility. I do know where your facility is. And I do see the extensive security just to get past the first two doors. And I'm sure as a police chief, you've probably gone to more emergency calls for drunkenness and, which usually causes some type of violence and such. I supported this in the beginning. I just don't think marijuana is the same. Like, I don't think people get marijuana and then go to their car and do it and then go, I mean, I don't know, maybe they do, but I would think that this is the type of product that people go home and use. So I don't necessarily have an issue with it, and I think a trial basis would be good just to double check, make sure that there are no issues. But I don't really have an issue with this.
And I would love to give an invite to give everyone a tour for the facility as well. And that's
Councilor Angelo.
Thank you, President Zio. I think I toured at the same time that you had toured with it. I was obviously very impressed and stuff. I'm much more liberal when it comes to marijuana, more so on the benefits of medicinal purposes. And I know you mentioned, have a higher recreation use and stuff, but I can even tell you about a story I had last night where, I had a dog that got hurt, and I had some CBD balm, and I was putting it on the dog's leg, and I was concerned, and I remember saying to myself last night, I wish there was a place that was open, because it was late when this happened, and I wanted to get some more. I couldn't get it, and I woke up this morning with the dog, and the dog was like, went from limping to just running around, and it was stuff that I use in my knees and stuff, because I've had one knee replacement, I had another one and stuff. So I'm certainly good with this, and I'm good with the fact that we're going to get, hopefully it's going
Counselor, is
to
there a question?
extend more revenue. But are you also seeing medicinal, like balms and other stuff, at nighttime or even other hours? Because we get pharmacies that are open till late at night too as well, that need certain things, and there's a lot of medical benefits to the CBD world.
We have carried, and we do carry currently a nice variety of CBD products, balms, salves, tinctures. Even we've carried CBD dog treats as well, and something we'll carry more of as well for you. So we also have in every different form, bath salts as well, edibles, gummies, chocolates, and stuff of that nature. So
You do expect a much bigger increase going to the 1 a.m.
we do get a lot of, we have, again, because of our pricing, because we're so competitive, again, like not only do we get medical patients from Rhode Island, but we have gotten some from Massachusetts as well.
Thank you.
Okay, additional questions, planning board? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Do we have anyone else to speak in favor? Do we have anyone to speak against? Do we have anyone to speak neither for nor against? Chair Whitehead, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open? Okay, Council Tavares?
Nope.
All right, I declare that public hearing closed as well. Thank you, planning board. Thank you for your patience this evening. She didn't want to leave. All right, and we will go on to a reading of the final public hearing of the evening.
Sure. Public hearing regarding a petition from Massachusetts Electric Company doing business as National Grid and Verizon New England Incorporated to install one JO pole on Dunham Street, install a stub pole 5116-84 south of pole 5116 30 feet plus or minus in sidewalk anchor guide to support leaning pole 5116 Attleboro.
Thank you. Do we have anyone to speak in favor? Do we have anyone to speak in favor? Anyone to speak against? Anyone to speak neither for nor against? Okay. Vice President Dolan, do you see any reason to keep this public hearing open? Guess not. We will declare that public hearing closed. And I would now entertain a motion to enter into committee of the whole.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Aye. Closed. We now in committee of the whole. If anyone has anything they would like to bring before the council. Good evening, Councilor.
Good evening. I am Richard Conti, 100 Berwick Road, Attleboro, Massachusetts. Mr. President, I have 4 issues that I would like to address with the council. If I could have 3 minutes for each issue, I would appreciate it.
According to the rules, sir, it's 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
Committee of the whole.
I promise to take 3. Issue number 1, I solidly believe that the mayor needs a chief of staff. And I believe it because I have been deeply involved in the city of Attleboro administration and the city of Taunton administration. Attleboro does not have a chief of staff, and Taunton does. The chief of staff in Taunton is a lawyer, a Juris Doctor. She is in the building before everybody else. I've tested her as early as 6:45, and we all show up for work at 8 o'clock. What Leisure, the chief of staff in Taunton, does for the city is save a lot of money in city solicitor expenses, because sitting next to the mayor as a chief of staff has visibility to the issues that are being confronted to the city and is able to step into them early. and either inspire negotiation or avoid confrontation and litigation. In addition to that, she does employee programs, which are very, very beneficial. So I think that the city of Attleboro, being about the size of the city of Taunton, and having been intimate in the job of Kevin Dumas and Paul Heroux, and watching Kathleen, it's time. This city has gotten to the size where a chief of staff up there is in order, and I believe it should be an attorney. And that completes my comments in 1 minute and 47 seconds. Any questions or comments that I can address?
You said you had several, so it's 4 minutes total, Counselor.
Oh, 4 minutes total. So we're going to race along then. Issue number 2 is I am donating $100 to the Attleboro Fireworks Fund, and I'm here to challenge all of you to do the same. If we all give $100 to the Attleboro Fireworks Fund, that's $1,200. That's 1/65th of what they need to raise. $100. You all got raises this year. Cough it up. And join me in my challenge to give $100 to the Fireworks Fund. Done. Number 3. Number 3 was, I'm getting old.
Got a lot on your plate.
Yeah. Chief of Staff, fireworks. Oh, 7 o'clock. You guys need to continue to meet at 7 o'clock. It is historical. It has been set in tradition. People do not watch you every week like me. People do not pay attention to what you're doing the way that I pay attention to it. And as a result, when they want to come and talk to you, they think you're going to meet at 7 o'clock, just like I did tonight. And when they want to speak to you in committee of the whole, they think that if they can get here by 7 o'clock, 7:30, they'll have that opportunity to address the council. You change the meeting time to 6:30 and have the committee of the whole before 7 o'clock, they're going to come here and they're not going to have an opportunity to speak. And some of them don't need to speak personally, but it sometimes is more convincing to speak to you in person than to send you a letter. So I strongly support maintaining the 7 o'clock, just like historically has been kept, just like the surrounding towns are meeting. 7 o'clock is when you should meet. Yes, if you've got a long night, because I personally think you should quit at 10:30 regardless. Nothing good happens after 10:30. Trust me, I spent 14 years in that chair. So I think that you should also recess at 10:30, but please hold on to the 7 o'clock meeting time. Now, the fourth thing, I regret, I should have written it down. I don't remember.
You can see you in 2 weeks at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, you might see me in 2 weeks at 7 o'clock. Thank you, councilors, for listening to me.
Rick, always good to see you. Do we have anyone else who wishes to address the council? Would entertain a motion to arise from committee of the whole. Thank you. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? We have arisen of committee of the whole. We are now going to a reading of the mayor's communications.
Dear Municipal Council, for your information, I regret to inform your honorable body we have received the resignation of Erin Connell from the Sustainability Commission. Please join me in thanking Ms. Connell for her service to the city.
It's an FYI, and thank you to Erin Connell.
Number 2, I respectfully submit a communication from Director of Budget and Administration Mason Lord regarding the fiscal year 25 snow deficit. As you are aware, the fiscal year 2026 proposed budget did not include the fiscal year 2025 snow deficit as an amount to raise on the fiscal year 2026 tax recalculation. Additionally, a final fiscal year 2025 snow deficit amount was not presented as invoices were still in process. The fiscal year 2025 snow deficit is now finalized at $646,152.95. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body appropriate $646,152.95 from undesignated fund balance free cash general government to the following accounts.
May I waive the reading of those?
Thank you. $84,127.19 to snow ice control overtime snow removal.
You may.
Oh, I can read the whole thing?
No, you don't need to.
Sorry, I
Yep.
thought you said the account
Then you can
numbers.
just, nope, sorry, and then you can just read the last sentence,
Sure.
please. Thank you.
In order to be able to process this request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Thank you. Public Works Committee, please.
Number 3, I respectfully submit a communication from Fire Chief Scott T. LaChance regarding the need for funds for firefighter certification differential due to the numerous firefighters obtaining department-approved certifications after the fire department budget was approved. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer $7,000 from account 122-01000-513021, fire dispatch overtime, to account 122-01000-514045, fire certification differential. In order to be able to process this request for the end of the fiscal 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Public Safety and Emergency Management, please.
Number 4, I respectfully submit a communication from Fire Chief Scott T. LaChance regarding the need for funds for overtime. Recently, the fire department has experienced several firefighter absences as a result of on-duty injuries, off-duty injuries, and military deployments. As a result of these absences, there's a projected deficit in the fire department overtime. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer $48,000 to account 122-0100-513000, fire overtime, from the following: $24,000 from account 122-01000-558310, fire uniforms; $24,000 from account 122-01000-532010, fire tuition and books. In order to be able to process this request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Public Safety and Emergency Management, and Assistant Clerk, you can just read the name of the account in the parentheses. You don't need to read.
I don't
all.
have to do the account
Nope,
numbers.
nope.
Thank you.
No worries. There's a lot of those account numbers. So
Perfect.
Make
Love
it easier on you, my friend.
Thank you. All right. I respectfully submit a communication from Director of Council of Aging Kelly Lee regarding the need for funds to rent temporary air conditioning units at 25 South Main Street for the summer months due to the malfunctioning HVAC system. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer $13,462 from Citywide Reserve Fund for transfer to Council on Aging HVAC. In order to be able to process this request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
City Property and Claims, please.
6, I respectfully submit a communication from the Superintendent of Water, Dennis Morton, regarding the need for several transfers to pay for services and supplies for the remainder of fiscal year 2025. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer $50,000 from account Water Enterprise Fund, Reserve Fund for transfer to the following:
You can waive the reading of the accounts. We'll go over that in committee.
Okay.
And then the last sentence, please.
In order to be able to process the request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Thank you. Public Works Department, please.
7, I respectfully submit a communication from the Director of Budget and Administration, Mason Lord, requesting funding for Lindsay Street pavement restoration. As you are aware, the full water main replacement on Lindsay Street from the North Attleboro Town Line to Pleasant Street was funded through Bristol County ARPA. Due to the cost of the replacement and the timing of obligating and expending Bristol County ARPA funds, the full pavement restoration of Lindsay Street was not able to be funded through the Bristol County ARPA program. We have made note of this fact many times in the past year, as well as stating that the full pavement restoration could not begin until after the temporary paving settled through a freeze winter cycle. Now that the paving has settled through winter, we anticipate that the full paving restoration is expected to commence this fall, subject to securing the necessary funding. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body appropriate $1,271,900 from undesignated fund balance free cash, general government, to fund 3575 roadway repairs for the Lindsay Street pavement restoration project. In order to be able to process this request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Public Works Committee, please.
8, I respectfully submit a communication from the Superintendent of Park and Forestry, Derek Corsi, regarding the donation of a painted mural for the Capron Park Zoo valued at approximately $2,376.18 from the Olivia Knighton Foundation. The mural will be located in the center of the zoo near the flagpole and butterfly sculpture. In accordance with Section 1-12 of the revised ordinance of the City of Attleboro, I hereby request your honorable body to accept this generous donation to the City of Attleboro.
City Property and Claims, please.
9, I respectfully submit a communication from the Superintendent of Parks, Forestry, and Animal Control, Derek Corsi, regarding the needs for funds for animal control overtime for the remainder of fiscal year 25. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer $2,200 from account Citywide Reserve Fund for transfer to the following: $1,000 to animal control callback overtime, $1,200 to animal control holiday sick vacation overtime. In order to be able to process this request for the end of the fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Public Works Committee, please.
10, I respectfully submit for your confirmation by the honorable body of appointment of Ann Berth Eugene to fill an expired term on the Youth Commission. Term to expire February 2027.
Personnel, Veterans, Human Services, please.
11, I respectfully submit for the confirmation by your honorable body the appointment of Destiny Cyril to fill an expired term on the Youth Commission. Term to expire February 2027.
Personnel, Veterans, Human Services, please.
12, I respectfully submit a communication from Director of Budget and Administration Mason Lord concerning funding for certain fiscal year 26 capital improvements program vehicle replacements. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body appropriate $1,374,020 from account undesignated fund balance free cash general government to fund 3523 vehicle equipment for the purchase and equipping of fiscal year 26 capital improvements program, items including 3 DPW 6 to 8 yard dump trucks, a DPW sweeper, a fire command vehicle, 2 police motorcycles, a park and forestry vehicle, and an animal control vehicle. A 15% contingency has been added to this funding request for unforeseen cost to purchase and equip all the vehicles. In order to be able to process this request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
13, I respectfully submit a communication from the Director of Budget and Administration, Mason Lord, concerning fiscal year 25 free cash contributions to the Reserve Fund for Stabilization and the Reserve Fund for Special Education Stabilization. On October 16th, 2024, the city's July 1st, 2024, general fund fee cash was certified at $12,858,202. And as the end of the fiscal year approaches, it is imperative that these contributions be made before June 30th. Establishing and maintaining adequate levels of reserve funds help to mitigate financial risk that can occur from unforeseen revenue fluctuations, unanticipated expenditures, and economic downtowns. Moreover, as described in more detail in Mason's memo, the import of building up our reserve funds became even increasingly important during the city's most recent S&P ratings call in fall 2024, when we were informed that S&P Global had overhauled its rating methodology for governments. According to the city's financial advisor, the new financial reserve requirements for AA stable ratings are now what the reserve requirements used to be for the AAA ratings. Accordingly, I hereby request that your honorable body appropriate $2,001,653.42 from account undesignated fund balance, free cash general government, to account citywide contribution to stabilization fund. Further, I hereby request that your honorable body appropriate $578,318.87 from account undesignated fund balance, free cash general government, to account citywide contribution to SPED. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
14. For your information, I regret to inform your honorable body we have received the resignation of Ethan Pipes from the Sustainability Commission. Please join me in thanking Mr. Pipes for his service to the city.
That's an FYI, and I think we'll all join the mayor in thanking Mr. Pipes for his service.
15. I respectfully submit for the confirmation by your honorable body the appointment of Benton Keene III to fill an expired term on the Board of Fire Commissioners, term to expire February 27.
Personnel, Veterans, Human Services, please.
16. I respectfully submit a communication from Superintendent of Wastewater Thomas Hayes regarding the residential meter replacement program and the shared meter expense between the city's water and wastewater enterprise departments. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body appropriate $31,556.91 from account Wastewater Enterprise Fund retained earnings to account Wastewater Enterprise Fund water meter supplies. After such time, the accounting department will work with the wastewater department to transfer the funds to the Water Enterprise Fund. In order to be able to process this request for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Public Works Department, please.
All right, 17. I respectfully submit a communication from City Auditor Deborah Gould regarding unissued debt for Fund 3342 Front End Loader. On February 7th, 2023, the Honorable Municipal Council authorized $355,000 for the purpose of purchasing a new front-end loader for the Water Department. The total debt issued was $15,000 less than the amount authorized. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body that $15,000 of authorized unissued debt from the February 7th, 2023 authorization for the acquisition of the front-end loader for the Water Department be rescinded as the project is completed and no further debt should be issued from this authorization. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of fiscal year 2025, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
18. I respectfully submit a communication from City Auditor Deborah Gould regarding unissued debt for Fund 3224 Wastewater SCADA. On February 18th, 2021, the Honorable Municipal Council authorized $943,000 for the purpose of the replacement of the wastewater SCADA system. The total debt issued was $93,000 less than the amount authorized. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body that $93,000 of the debt authorized in February 2021 for the wastewater SCADA project be rescinded. Additionally, I hereby request your honorable body transfer the unused portion of Council Vote Number 3 from April 18th, 2023 in the amount of $17,250 from Fund Wastewater SCADA, Other Financing Uses, to account Wastewater Enterprise Fund, Other Financing Sources. These funds originated as a transfer from the Wastewater Enterprise Fund for project costs identified after the long-term borrowing was completed and are also no longer needed. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of fiscal year 2025, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
19. I respectfully submit a communication from City Auditor Deborah Gould requesting to close Fund 3230 Sand Filter Improvements. On April 19th, 2022, your honorable body funded the repair of 3 failing sand filters at the wastewater treatment facility in the amount of $500,000. Superintendent Thomas Hayes has informed the auditing department that the sand filter project is complete, all invoices have been paid, and the project can be closed out. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer the unused portion of $111,835.25 from Fund Sand Filter Improvements, Other Financing Uses, to account Wastewater Enterprise Fund, Other Financing Sources. These funds originated as an appropriation from the Wastewater Enterprise Fund, retained earnings, and the closing of this fund to the Wastewater Enterprise Fund will increase the equity in the fund at the end of the fiscal year 2025. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
20. I respectfully submit a communication from the City Auditor Deborah Gould regarding unissued debt for Fund 3546 Library Project. On June 23, 2020, your honorable body authorized $6,900,000 for the purpose of design, permitting, bid services, construction oversight services, and construction associated with the remodeling, reconstruction, and extraordinary repairs of the roof, HVAC system, window repairs, and the elevator improvements to the Attleboro Public Library. The total debt issued for the project was $1,727,964.79, less than the amount authorized. The Office of the City Auditor has been notified that the project is complete and that all invoices have been paid. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body that $1,727,964.79 of the debt authorized in June 2020 for the purpose of design, permitting, bid services, construction, oversight services, and construction associated with the remodeling, reconstruction, and extraordinary repairs to the roof, HVAC system, window repairs, and elevator improvements to the Attleboro Public Library be rescinded. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of the fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
21. I respectfully submit a communication from City Auditor Deborah Gould regarding unissued debt for Fund 3429 Brennan Wamsutta Roof Project. On February 18th, 2020, your honorable body authorized $3,900,000 for the purpose of permitting, bidding, construction, oversight, and construction costs associated with the remodeling, reconstructing, and making extraordinary repairs to the roofs of both the Brennan and Wamsutta middle schools. On December 15th, 2020, the loan authorization was amended to include the removal and replacement of gymnasium floors and environmental hygienist monitoring at Hyman Fine and Hill Roberts Elementary Schools. The total debt issued for the project was $360,180.74 less than the amount authorized. The Office of the City Auditor has been notified that the projects are complete and that all invoices have been paid. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body that $360,180.74 of the debt authorized in February 2020 for the purpose of permitting, bidding, construction, oversight, and construction costs associated with the remodeling, reconstructing, and making extraordinary repairs to the roofs of both the Brennan and Wamsutta middle schools, and further amended on December 15th, 2020, to include the removal and replacement of gymnasium floors and environmental hygienist monitoring at Hyman Fine and Hill Roberts Elementary Schools be rescinded. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Finance Committee, please.
Almost there.
Almost done. I respectfully submit for confirmation by your honorable body the appointment of Anjali Srinivasan to fill an expired term on the Sustainability Commission. term to expire February 2028.
Personnel, Veterans, Human Services Committee, please.
23, I respectfully submit for confirmation by your honorable body the appointment of Kevin Malone to fill an expired term on the Sustainability Commission. Term to expire February 2028.
Personnel, Veterans, Human Services Committee, please.
24, for your information, I regret to inform your honorable body we have received the resignation of Marion Aspinall from the Council on Aging effective July 1st, 2025. Please join me in thanking Ms. Aspinall for her service to the city.
It's an FYI to everyone, and Marion, thank you very much for your service.
25, I respectfully submit a communication from the Director of Recreation, Christy Clausen, regarding the needs for funds to pay previous year's bills to National Grid. Therefore, I hereby request your honorable body transfer $7,857.28 from account Citywide Reserve Fund for transfer to account Recreation previous year's bills. In order to be able to process these requests for the end of fiscal year 2025 deadline, I hereby request your honorable body to consider this prior to June 30th, 2025.
Thank you. That'll go to Public Works. Well done.
Thank you.
And there is no clerk's communication, so we will go into committee reports, and we will begin with Councilor Tavares, who's covering for Councilor Cobus again, who has work obligations this evening. So thank you.
Reporting for the Finance Committee, from the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to transfer $45,000 from account 11241000-578300, Citywide Reserve Fund for transfer to account 11241000-521030, Citywide Streetlights, in order to pay invoices for the remainder of fiscal year 25.
Second.
Thank you. Motion's in order. Any comments?
It's just a FY25 invoice.
Thank you very much. Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, we'll have a roll call vote beginning with Councilor Foa.
Ms. Foa.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan.
Yes.
Ms. Holmes.
Yes.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
Mr. Waterman.
Yes.
Mr. Tavares.
Yes.
President Delicio.
Yes.
All right, we have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to transfer $113,850 from account 1124100-578380 Citywide Reserve Fund for Capital to account 1124100-599300 Citywide Transfer to Capital Fund, and to further transfer $113,850 to Fund 3578-499600 Balfour Bridge transfer from General Fund.
Second.
Thank you. Motion's in order. Any comments?
It's just a much-needed capital project, and we discussed this at length in our committee meeting.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, we'll have roll call vote beginning with Mr. Tavares.
Mr. Tavares.
Yes.
Mr. Waterman.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes.
Ms. Holmes.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Ms. Foa.
Yes.
President Delicio.
Yes.
We have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
From the docket of May 6, 2025, I move to strike a proposed amendment to Section 2-1.3 of the revised ordinances as follows. Strike Section 2-1.3 in its entirety and replace with 2-1.3 Special Assistant to the Mayor.
Second.
Thank you. We'll waive the reading. Any questions, comments, concerns?
No comments.
Any additional questions or concerns? Seeing none, this will be a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
And that concludes the business
Excuse
of...
me. Oh, sorry.
Point of
I
order.
think there's one we might have missed for the school department. Is that what you were gonna say, Diana?
Yes. Page 2.
495,
Page 2.
495,000.
On the bottom of page 2.
I see. Thank you. From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to authorize the school department to obligate up to $495,000 of its FY25 net school spending appropriation towards potentially non-net school spending eligible expenditures.
Second.
Thank you. Motion is in order. Any comments?
No comments, we discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a roll call vote beginning with Ms. Foa.
All right. Ms. Foa.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan?
Yes.
Ms. Holmes?
Yes.
Mr. Angelo?
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman?
Yes.
Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
And President Delicio?
Yes.
9 yeas, 0 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you for that, because there's another piece of business I also missed. From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to transfer $58,000 from account 1124100-578380 Citywide Reserve Fund for Capital to account 1210100-587060 Police Vehicle and Equipment Replacement.
Second.
Thank you. Motion's in order. Any comments?
We also discussed this at length in committee. I have no additional comments there.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a roll call vote, beginning with Mr. Tavares.
Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman?
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer?
Yes.
Mr. Angelo?
Yes.
Ms. Holmes?
Yes.
Vice President Dolan?
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy?
Yes.
Ms. Foa?
Yes.
President Delicio?
Yes.
9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
And that now concludes the business of the Finance Committee, that the Finance Committee has before the council. We call for a committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for covering. Bless you. Councilor Foa.
The IT and Infrastructure Committee has no business this evening. Call for the committee meeting next appropriate time.
Thank you. Councilor Lavoy.
The licensing committee also has no business this evening, and we too would call for the committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
I'll be calling a committee meeting for city property and claims at the next appropriate time. Vice President Dolan.
Thank you. From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to appropriate $11,183.09 from account wastewater enterprise fund retained earnings to account wastewater enterprise fund bill from previous year to cover National Grid bill from the previous year.
Second.
Thank you. Motion is in order. Any comments?
No, we discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? I believe this is
Foa.
Foa, correct?
Ms. Foa?
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy?
Yes.
Vice President Dolan?
Yes.
Ms. Holmes?
Yes.
Mr. Angelo?
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman?
Yes.
Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
President Delicio?
Yes.
9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you. From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to approve the following transfers for pickleball court improvements at Nickerson Park.
We will waive the reading. It's seconded by Councilor Holmes. Motion is in order. Okay. So if you don't have any comments, no
Well,
comments.
I was waiting for you to say, do you have any
Do you have any comments?
I don't.
Okay, we have no comments. Additional questions, comments, concerns? It's been a long couple weeks.
Well, I was,
God.
yeah, anyway,
Okay,
we discussed in committee.
all right, very good. Additional questions, comments, concerns? All right, seeing none, this will be a roll call vote, begin with Mr. Tavares.
All right. Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman?
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer?
Yes.
Mr. Angelo?
Yes.
Ms. Holmes? Vice President Dolan?
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy?
Yes.
And Ms. Foa?
Yes.
President Delicio?
Yes,
That is 9 yeas and 0 nays.
thank you, motion passes.
Oh, and that's all the business of the Public Works Committee, and I'd like to call for a committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
You got it. Councilor Holmes.
Thank you. Reporting for Public Safety and Emergency Management Committee, I have 2 items this evening. From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to approve the expenditure of grant funds anticipated to be received for fiscal year 26 by the Attleboro Police Department from the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, State 911 Department, in the amount of $165,733, and also approve any further grant amendments.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order, any comments?
There, this is, we don't have to match this, and it's just a grant provided to the police department.
Thank you. Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, we'll have a roll call vote, beginning with Ms. Foa.
Okay, Ms. Foa?
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy?
Yes.
Vice President Dolan?
Yes.
Ms. Holmes?
Yes.
Mr. Angelo?
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman?
Yes.
Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
President Delicio?
Yes,
We have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
motion passes.
From the docket of June 3rd, 2025, I move to appropriate $132,000 from account undesignated fund balance, free cash general fund to fund 3582 fire alarms console upgrade.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order, any comments?
I do. This was one of those items that Mason was speaking about earlier. Remember, there were 6 items, and they said one was before the council. This is one of them.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a roll call vote, beginning with Mr. Tavares.
Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes.
Ms. Holmes.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Ms. Foa.
Yes.
President Delicio.
Yes.
We have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you, motion passes.
That concludes the business, and I'll call for committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
Thank you, Councilor Angelo.
Thank you, President Delicio. Reporting for Personnel, Veterans, and Human Service Committee for the docket of June 3rd, 2025. Move to approve the appointment of Joseph Parent to fill an expired term on the Board of Fire Commissioners, term to expire February 2028.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
Discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a voice vote. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
On the docket of June 3rd, 2025, move to approve the appointment of Frank Cook to fill an unexpired term on the Board of Fire Commissioners, term to expire February 2026.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
No, sir. We discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this too is a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
On the docket of June 3rd, 2025, move to approve the appointment of Amanda Soladina to fill an unexpired term on the Planning Board, term to expire February 2026.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
No, sir. We discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this is a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
From the docket of May 20th, 2025, move to resubmit the reappointment of Carrie Gray to the Council on Human Rights, term to expire February 2028.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
No, sir. Discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this is a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
On the docket of May 6th, 2025, excuse me, I move to approve the addition of licensed independent clinical social worker, LICSW, in SAT 3 position group to classification compensation plan.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
No, sir. We discussed in committee.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this is a roll call vote beginning with Councilor Foa.
Ms. Foa.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan.
Yes.
Ms. Holmes.
Yes.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
Mr. Waterman.
Yes.
Mr. Tavares.
Yes.
President Delicio.
Yes.
We have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you, motion passes.
That's all for Personnel, Veterans, and Human Services Committee. Call for meeting at next appropriate time.
Thank you, Councilor Sawyer.
There is no business for Zoning, Land Use, and Sustainability Committee, and call for a meeting at the next appropriate time.
Thank you, Councilor Waterman.
Traffic and Transportation has no business tonight. We'll meet at the next appropriate time.
Thank you, Councilor Tavares.
Reporting for ordinances, elections, and legislative matters from the docket of April 15, 2025, I move to amend section 15-1.4 as follows. Due to changes in state law, strike section 15-1.4 in its entirety and replace with the following.
We may waive the reading where you read it last week.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
As it states in the motion, the purpose of this ordinance change is to comply with changes in state law.
Thank you. Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a roll call vote beginning with Councilor Tavares.
Mr. Tavares.
Yes.
Mr. Waterman.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes.
Ms. Holmes.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Ms. Foa.
Yes.
President Delicio.
Yes.
We have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you, motion passes.
In the docket of April 15, 2025, I move to amend Chapter 12 of the revised ordinances as follows. Strike Section 12-3.3E in its entirety and replace with,
We'll waive the reading as you did that
Thank you.
last week.
Second.
Thank you, motion is in order. Any comments?
as we discussed in committee last week, and as we heard at the public hearing from Derek Corsi and Chief Hagney, this is really just closing a loop on our ability to enforce the prohibition of parking overnight on city parks and other city property, and that's pretty much it. I'm only adding park to this subsection in E, and then reorganizing 12-3.5. That's it.
Thank you. Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a roll call vote beginning with Ms. Foa.
Ms. Foa.
Yes.
Mr. Lavoy.
Yes.
Vice President Dolan.
Yes.
Ms. Holmes.
Yes.
Mr. Angelo.
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
Mr. Waterman.
Yes.
Mr. Tavares.
Yes.
President Delicio.
Yes.
We have 9 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
From the docket of April 1st, 2025, I move to hold a public hearing on July 15, 2025 regarding the attached home rule petition calling for the establishment of a board to oversee use and occupancy payments for manufactured housing community accommodations in the city of Attleboro.
Second.
Thank you. We'll waive the reading as you read that into the record last week. Thank you, Vice President Dolan. Motion is in order. Any comments?
This is just a call for the public hearing.
Requires a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
That concludes the business of ordinances, elections, and legislative matters. We call for committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
Thank you. Councilor Tavares.
The Special Committee on Tax Abatement Review has no business this evening. We call for committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
Councilor Angelo.
Special Committee on Compensation Classification has no new business, and we call for meeting at the next appropriate time.
Thank you. And Councilor Fowa.
The Special Committee on Rules and Procedures has one matter this evening, reporting for that committee from the docket of April 1st, 2025. I move to approve a proposed amendment to Council Rules and Procedures, Section 3-1.2, as follows. To revise the first sentence to read, regular meetings shall be held in the Attleboro City Hall Municipal Council Chambers, 77 Park Street, Attleboro, commencing at 6:30 p.m. Also,
We can waive the reading as you read it into committee last week. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Motion is in order. Any comments?
This is to change our meeting time to begin at 6:30 p.m. Rather than 7. As I said in committee, I'm against this. Councilor Kobus as well, who's not here tonight, also was against it, although he wanted the full council to vote on this. Other than that, I think we discussed it in committee fairly fully.
Additional questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, this will be a roll call vote, beginning with Councilor Tavares.
Mr. Tavares?
Yes.
Mr. Waterman?
No.
Ms. Sawyer?
No.
Mr. Angelo?
Yes.
Ms. Holmes?
Yes.
Vice President Dolan?
No.
Mr. Lavoy?
Yes.
And Ms. Fowa?
No.
Oh, sorry, we have 1, 2, 3. President Delicio?
Yes.
All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yeas and 3 nays.
Thank you. Motion passes.
5 to 4.
Councilor Fowa?
That concludes the business of the Special Committee on Rules and Procedures. Call for committee meeting at the next appropriate time.
Thank you. There is one piece of new business which I will recognize Councilor Angelo for.
Thank you, President Delicio. New business to be referred for study and recommendation. Proposed amendment to Article 7-1.7, Committee on Personnel, Veterans, and Human Services. Change name to Committee on Human Resources and Veterans.
Second.
Thank you. Motion is in order. Any comments?
Just it's kind of more of upkeeping and just kind of cleans it up.
Okay, thank you. I'm co-sponsoring this with you just as we turn the personnel, voted last year to turn the personnel department to the human resources. It just, as you said, it aligns better. Is there a second?
Second.
I think I
Did you?
probably did second.
Okay. Okay. Additional questions, comments, concerns on this? Okay, I'll assign that. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. I'll assign that to, for what's now the Personnel, Veterans, and Human Services Committee. That being said, there is no old business. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We adjourned at 9:08.